In the 41st millennium, there are no gods, only the faithful, the damned, and those who pretend the distinction matters. The Imperium had cataloged every breed of heresy, every flavor of Zeno's corruption, every shade of demonic incursion. They had taxonomies for blasphemy, protocols for impossible phenomena, and prayers for when reason failed. But when the naked blue giant materialized 3 astronomical units from Cadia Prime without ship, portal, or warning, every augur array in the sector simultaneously registered readings that translated to a single word in 17 languages. Impossible. Captain Hadrian Vex of the Cadian 8th watched through the observation dome of the defense station. Vigilance eternal as reality itself seemed to pause. One moment, the void was empty. The next, a figure stood suspended in hard vacuum where no figure could stand. Not floating. Standing, as though the absence of matter beneath his feet was merely a technicality he'd chosen to ignore. The figure was humanoid, roughly 3 meters tall, and glowed with an internal luminescence the color of a clear summer sky. A color Hadrian had only seen in pic captures from long-dead worlds where such things as summer still existed. Threat assessment, Hadrian barked. His tactical officer, a woman whose augmetic eye had seen 3 decades of service, stared at her console as if it had personally betrayed her. None of our weapon systems can achieve target lock, sir. It's like he's everywhere and nowhere. The cogitators are reporting his position as 17 different coordinates simultaneously. She looked up, and Hadrian saw something he'd never witnessed in her bionic lens. Fear. Sir, the Astronomicon just flickered. If you crave stories of cosmic collisions where omnipotent beings meet an empire built on faith alone, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who bear witness to impossible truths in the dark millennium. Dr. Jonathan Osterman, he still thought of himself by that name, though Dr. Manhattan was the label his previous universe had branded him with. Observed the defense station with the same clinical detachment he'd applied to everything since his transformation in 1959. Except 1959 was a temporal marker from a universe he'd left behind, and since implied a linear progression of time that no longer constrained him. He perceived this moment, and the moment 300 years hence when this station would be atoms, and the moment 8,000 years prior when the first humans had stumbled into this sector with crude warp drives that tore holes in reality itself. That last observation troubled him. Not the crude technology, primitive species always develop dangerously before developing wisely, but the holes themselves. They didn't behave according to any physical law he understood. They reached into something that wasn't space, wasn't time, wasn't any dimension describable through quantum mechanics or relativistic physics. The humans called it the warp, and even now he could feel it pressing against his consciousness like a discordant scream made of pure emotion. He had come to this universe seeking new understanding. His own cosmos had grown predictable, its quantum possibilities mapped to their inevitable conclusions. Even Ozymandias' squid, even the nuclear war he'd prevented and then allowed, even his departure to Mars, all of it had been predetermined the moment he'd stepped into the intrinsic field generator. He'd thought that by leaving his universe entirely, he might find something genuinely unpredictable. The warp was definitely unpredictable. It was also screaming at him in 4 distinct voices, each offering a different flavor of damnation wrapped in honeyed promises. Fascinating. Manhattan shifted his perception to examine the station more closely. Thousands of humans, each one a complex arrangement of particles held together by electromagnetic forces and the delusion of consciousness. But these humans were different. Their particles were denser somehow. Their molecular structures reinforced by something that read as pure belief given physical form. A woman in black armor registered as a void in reality, not empty, but aggressively null, a walking negation of the psychic phenomena that saturated this universe. A robed figure in the station's chapel blazed with connections to something massive and distant, a psychic presence so vast it made Manhattan pause. He perceived that presence more clearly. Terra, Holy Terra, as the humans designated it. And beneath the surface, in a throne of gold and suffering, something that had once been human, burned with the faith of quadrillions. The emperor of mankind, Manhattan could see him simultaneously across 10,000 years. But unlike Manhattan's own temporal perception, the emperor's timeline was wrong, fractured. The past was clear, but the future split into thousands of contradictory possibilities, each one overlapping and interfering with the others. Manhattan attempted to trace one timeline to its conclusion and felt his consciousness stumble for the first time since his transformation. The future refused to coalesce. It writhed like something alive, rewritten moment by the collective will of an empire spanning a million worlds. In his universe, the future was fixed, already written in the quantum substrate of the cosmos. Here the future was a battlefield where physics and faith waged eternal war. How extraordinary. He decided to move closer to the station, not teleport. He wanted to observe their response to approach. He began walking through vacuum toward the defense platform, each step carrying him thousands of kilometers as he compressed space around his passage. The station's weapons began firing. Lost batteries that should have vaporized anything organic splashed against his skin like raindrops. Macro cannons capable of cracking asteroids passed through him as he temporarily dispersed his molecular structure, then reconstituted after the shells had exited. A macro cannon shell should have destroyed him, but only in the sense that it should have destroyed the arrangement of atoms that comprised his body. Since he could rearrange those atoms at will, destroyed was a temporary inconvenience at most. But as he reformed, Manhattan noticed something troubling. The particles didn't snap back into configuration as instantly as they should have. There was drag, resistance, as if the universe itself was trying to reject his existence, replace it with something more compatible with local physical laws. The warp, he realized, was attempting to overwrite him with its own definition of reality. This was going to be more complicated than he'd anticipated. The Astronomicon was a lighthouse built from a psychic scream. 10,000 psychers sacrificed daily to maintain a beacon that allowed humanity to navigate the insanity of warp travel. Dr. Manhattan could perceive it clearly now, a golden spike of psychic energy that pierced through reality itself, anchored to the corpse emperor on his golden throne. The beacon called to him not with words but with absolute certainty, the kind of declaration that brooked no disagreement. You are seen. Manhattan paused his approach to the defense station. In his original universe, nothing had truly seen him after his transformation. Lori had tried, Dan had pretended to understand, Ozymandias had attempted to manipulate him, but none of them could perceive what he actually was, a pattern of quantum information that happened to be conscious. But this presence, this emperor, looked at him with recognition that transcended mere observation. The golden light of the Astronomicon bent toward him like a spotlight redirecting mid-performance, and Manhattan felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Another consciousness operating on his level. Not his equal, the Emperor was bound to linear time in ways Manhattan was not, but undeniably vast, undeniably aware, and undeniably interested in the azure intruder who'd stumbled into his imperium. The psychic contact came without warning, bypassing the normal electromagnetic frequencies humans used for communication and striking directly into the quantum substrate of Manhattan's consciousness. It wasn't language, it was compressed meaning, raw concept translated into something his transformed mind could parse. What are you, not who? The Emperor knew Manhattan was a what before a who, a thing that wore the shape of Jonathan Osterman, but had transcended the man who'd entered the intrinsic field generator. The recognition was unnerving. Manhattan had grown accustomed to being incomprehensible. Being comprehended was a different matter entirely. Manhattan considered his response. He could communicate through conventional means, teleport to Terra, manifest a vocal apparatus, explain his origin in words the Emperor's attendants could transcribe, but that seemed inefficient. Instead, he reached toward the golden light with his own consciousness, letting his quantum signature carry meaning in the same compressed format, transformed, seeking, observing. The response was immediate and carried the weight of 10,000 years of exhausted patience. Observing? What? Manhattan expanded his perception, drinking in the spectacle of the 41st millennium. The imperium of man sprawled across the galaxy like a dying giant too stubborn to notice its own necrosis. A million worlds, each one a festering wound of overpopulation, industrial collapse, and fanatical devotion to a god who'd explicitly denied his own divinity. The warp pressed against reality at every point, leaking demons and madness through cracks in the fabric of space. Xenos empires carved out their own territories, elegant Eldar mourning their fall, mechanistic Necrons awakening from eons of slumber, brutish orcs reveling in endless war, and the Tyranids. Manhattan recoiled slightly. The Tyranids were hunger-given form, a hive mind so vast and alien, it registered as a blank space in his perception where trillions of individual organisms should have existed. They consumed entire worlds, breaking them down to base components and incorporating the biomass into their ever-expanding swarm. They were the ultimate expression of evolution, stripped of consciousness, purpose without thought, efficiency without mercy. And threading through it all, the warp. That impossible realm of emotion and unreason where demons were born from mortal feelings and gods fed on the psychic emanations of thinking beings. Manhattan could perceive the four greatest powers, entities that his previous universe would have categorized as impossible, but here were devastatingly real. They watched him with interest, whispering possibilities into the quantum foam of his awareness. Change, evolution, transformation. That was the blue one, the architect, the schemer. Rage, strength, conquest. The red one, brass and blood and eternal warfare. Decay, acceptance, endurance. The green one offering the peace of entropy. Sensation, perfection, excess. The purple one, promising experiences beyond even Manhattan's expanded consciousness. He found them all fascinating and none of them remotely tempting. They offered power, but Manhattan had power. They offered transformation, but he'd already been transformed beyond mortal comprehension. They offered knowledge, but he could perceive the molecular structure of their promises and found them wanting. Each offer came with a price calculated to damn the recipient in ways both subtle and absolute. The Emperor's presence intensified, breaking Manhattan's examination of the Chaos Gods. They will corrupt you. Manhattan returned his attention to the golden light. The Emperor's warning carried the weight of experience. This was a being who'd fought chaos for 10 millennia and understood its seductive mathematics better than any other entity in the galaxy. But the warning also carried an assumption Manhattan found curious, that he could be corrupted. I perceive the transactional nature of their offers. They require belief to function. I do not believe. The Emperor's response came with something that might have been amusement, or possibly despair. The emotional context was difficult to parse. Belief, irrelevant. The warp, cares, not what you believe, only what you are. That was troubling. Manhattan's entire existence was predicated on his understanding of quantum mechanics and particle physics. Belief was the province of those who lacked complete information. He didn't believe in gravity. He understood the curvature of space-time caused by mass. He didn't believe in electromagnetism. He perceived the exchange of photons between charged particles. Belief was for humans who needed faith to bridge the gap between observation and comprehension. But the warp didn't care about his comprehension. It operated on different principles entirely, principles that his quantum-based consciousness found genuinely alien. Here was a realm where emotion had mass, where faith could reshape reality, where the collective unconscious of thinking beings could birth entities that then fed upon those same beings in a perpetual cycle of psychic predation. I do not understand the warp, Manhattan admitted. Good, the Emperor responded. Understanding is corruption. The warp understands you. That is sufficient. Before Manhattan could process that deeply uncomfortable statement, the golden light withdrew, and he found himself facing the defense station once more. The station had stopped firing. Either they'd exhausted their ammunition attempting to destroy him, or they'd received orders to cease. Either way, Manhattan could see small craft launching from the station's docking bays, boarding torpedoes and assault shuttles, all heading directly toward his position in the void. The humans, it seemed, had decided that if they couldn't destroy him at range, they would attempt to confront him directly, admirable in its futility. Manhattan waited, standing motionless in hard vacuum, as the first boarding torpedo reached his position and deployed its cargo. 20 figures in black power armor materialized in the void around him, each one bearing weapons that crackled with psychic energy. Their armor bore the symbol of an ornate eye, the Inquisition, the Emperor's chosen enforcers. Their leader, a woman whose armor was etched with prayers in High Gothic, ignited a force sword that burned with the same golden light as the Astronomicon. She didn't waste time with demands or threats. She simply attacked. The Inquisitor's force sword passed through Dr. Manhattan's neck with a sound like reality tearing. The blade, a weapon forged to channel psychic energy through a crystalline matrix capable of severing the connection between demons and the warp itself, should have unmade anything it touched. Instead, it emerged from the other side of Manhattan's throat without resistance, leaving his glowing blue form completely intact. Inquisitor Vacaria Stern had personally banished 17 greater demons, purged 43 heretical cults, and orchestrated the exterminatus of 2 planets too corrupted to salvage. In a century of service to the God Emperor, she had never encountered anything her blade couldn't harm. She struck again, this time aiming for the center of mass. The Force's sword passed through ribs that should have existed, through organs that should have bled, through a spine that should have shattered. Manhattan observed her efforts with detached curiosity. The weapon was fascinating. It existed simultaneously in both real space and the warp, using psychic energy to give its edge properties that transcended conventional matter. Against a demon, which was essentially compressed warp energy given temporary form in real space, such a weapon would be devastating. Against Manhattan, who was matter arranged in a quantum configuration he could restructure at will, it was merely an interesting display. "You are under arrest by order of the Ordo Malleus," Vacaria declared through her armor's Vox speakers, her voice rendered cold and mechanical by the transmission. "You will submit to interrogation and judgment. Resistance will be met with immediate termination." Manhattan considered pointing out that she'd already attempted termination, and it hadn't taken. Instead, he simply spoke, his voice carrying through the vacuum despite the physical impossibility. He was vibrating the particles of cosmic dust around them to create the necessary pressure waves. "I am not your enemy. That determination is not yours to make, Xenos filth. I am not Xenos. I was human." Jonathan Osterman, born 1929, died 1959, reborn the same day. Vacaria gestured, and her squad opened fire. Bolt rounds exploded against Manhattan's chest, mass reactive shells designed to penetrate armor before detonating inside the target. Each round passed through his dispersed molecular structure and exploded harmlessly in the void beyond. Plasma weapons superheated the space around him to temperatures that should have vaporized any organic matter. Melta weapons unleashed subatomic destruction that could reduce tank armor to slag. Manhattan stood unchanged, waiting for them to exhaust their arsenal. When the firing ceased, he spoke again. "Your weapons operate on the principle that matter has fixed structural integrity. I do not have that limitation. You cannot harm me through conventional destruction." "Then we will find unconventional means," Vacaria replied. She deactivated her force sword and drew a different weapon. A small device that resembled a crystalline pyramid, its surface etched with wards that made Manhattan's perception skip. Like frames missing from a film reel, there were gaps in his ability to perceive the object's quantum state, a null field generator. Of course, Vacaria activated the device, and Manhattan felt a sensation he hadn't experienced since his transformation: absence. The field expanded outward, creating a sphere of negation that suppressed psychic phenomena within its radius. Since the warp permeated this entire universe, creating a zone where the warp couldn't exist required technology that functioned as a controlled tear in reality, a bubble of normal space where only conventional physics applied. Manhattan felt his perception of local timelines collapse. The branching futures he'd been observing simultaneously snapped into a single, linear progression. His awareness of the station's past and future vanished, leaving only the present moment. For the first time since entering this universe, he was experiencing time the way normal humans did, one second after another. Unable to see what came next, it was disorienting and strangely refreshing. Now, Vakaria said, stepping closer, you will answer our questions. What is your nature? What is your purpose in this sector? Who do you serve? Manhattan focused on the present moment, the only moment available to him within the null field. My nature is difficult to explain in terms you would find meaningful. I am a quantum observer given autonomous form. My purpose is to understand phenomena I have not previously encountered. I serve no one. Everything serves someone, another inquisitor interjected, his armor marked with the symbol of the Ordo Hereticus. Faith, ideology, power, survival, all beings are bound by motivation. What binds you, creature? Curiosity, the word hung in the void between them. Manhattan could see the inquisitors processing this answer through their augmetic displays, running it through their cogitators, analyzing it for deception. But it was simply true. He'd left his universe because it had become predictable. He'd come here seeking unpredictability. The warp provided that in abundance. Curiosity killed the cat, Vakaria said. It was clearly an expression from some cultural reference Manhattan lacked context for. In the Imperium, curiosity is often the first step toward corruption. Tell me, creature, have the ruinous powers spoken to you? Manhattan saw no reason to lie. Yes, 4 distinct entities offering various forms of transformation, power, or experience. I declined all offers. The Inquisitor's weapons immediately came up again, tracking him with renewed threat assessment. Vakaria's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You have had direct contact with chaos and you claim to remain uncorrupted? That is impossible. I perceive their nature before accepting communication. They are predatory entities that feed on belief and emotion. Since I possess neither in forms they can consume, their corruption vectors are ineffective against my quantum structure. Nothing is immune to chaos, the Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor snapped. Even the Emperor himself must maintain constant vigilance against their influence. You expect us to believe you, an unknown entity with unknown allegiances, can simply resist the whispers of the dark gods through rational observation? Manhattan considered the question. In his original universe, Ozymandias had asked him something similar. Did he truly believe he could remain detached from human affairs simply because he'd transcended human limitations? The answer then had been no. He'd ultimately intervened in Ozymandias' plan despite his professed indifference. But this situation was different. The Chaos Gods weren't appealing to his emotions or his sense of moral duty. They were offering transactions he had no need to complete. I do not resist them, Manhattan explained. Resistance implies effort against temptation. I simply observe their offers and calculate that the costs exceed any possible benefits. This is not faith or willpower. It is mathematics. Vakaria's force sword reignited. Mathematics cannot save you from damnation, creature. Faith is the only true shield against the darkness. Then why, Manhattan asked, did the Emperor warn me that understanding the warp leads to corruption? If faith alone was sufficient, knowledge would be irrelevant. The Inquisitors froze. Even within her sealed armor, Manhattan could detect Vakaria's elevated heart rate, the micro-expressions of shock that her training couldn't quite suppress. You claim to have spoken with the Emperor? Her voice carried a mixture of reverence and suspicion. The master of mankind does not commune with random Xenos anomalies. I am not Xenos. I am post-human. And yes, he reached out through the Astronomicon and asked what I was observing. We exchanged information. Lies, the Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor snarled. The Emperor has not spoken directly to anyone in 10,000 years. You are either deluded or deliberately blaspheming. Manhattan perceived the molecular structure of the null field generator and understood its operational principles within seconds. The device created a localized reality bubble by using crystalline matrices to reflect warp energy back on itself, creating destructive interference that canceled psychic phenomena. Clever engineering. but it had limitations. He reached out and restructured several key components of the device at the atomic level, introducing microscopic fractures in the crystalline matrix that would cause cascading failure in approximately 12 seconds. "The Emperor spoke to me," Manhattan repeated calmly. "You may verify this with your superiors. I suspect they will be interested in what he shared." The null field generator sparked, overloaded, and exploded in Vicaria's hand. The bubble of normal space collapsed, and Manhattan's full temporal perception snapped back into place. He could once again see the branching futures, the multiple timelines, the quantum possibilities spiraling outward from each present moment. In 47% of observed futures, the Inquisitors attempted to destroy him with cyclonic torpedoes. In 32%, they fled to Terra to report his existence. In 18%, they attempted to capture him through increasingly creative means. In 3%, they actually listened. He decided to optimize for that 3%. "I am not your enemy," Manhattan said again, "but I am also not your ally. I am here to observe, to understand, and to determine whether this universe contains phenomena worth extended study. You may report my existence to your superiors. You may attempt to destroy me again if it provides you comfort, or you may simply let me continue my investigation while you attend to more immediate threats." He gestured toward the Cadian Gate, where the Eye of Terror churned with chaotic energies. "You have far more pressing concerns than one transformed human exploring your Imperium." Vicaria stared at him for a long moment, her force sword still ignited, her squad still maintaining firing positions. Finally, she spoke. "You will accompany us to Cadia Prime. You will submit to further interrogation. And if even a single particle of your being registers as chaos-tainted, I will find a way to unmake you that even your quantum manipulation cannot reverse. This I swear by the Emperor's golden throne." Manhattan calculated the probable outcomes of refusing. Suboptimal. The Imperium would escalate, and while he could certainly survive their attempts at destruction, the conflict would distract from his primary purpose. "Acceptable," he said. They didn't lower their weapons for the entire journey to the planet's surface. Cadia Prime was a fortress world in the most literal sense. Its entire surface had been converted into defense installations, trenches, bunkers, and weapons batteries. From orbit, Manhattan could perceive layer upon layer of fortifications built over millennia, each generation adding to the planetary armor until the original topography had been completely erased. 8 million soldiers were stationed here at any given moment, and every Cadian citizen was trained for warfare from childhood. The planet's motto, etched into monuments across its surface, was simple: Cadia stands. Manhattan found the defiance poignant. The Eye of Terror dominated the sky, a massive wound in reality where the warp had torn through into real space 10,000 years ago. From this planet, the citizens could literally see damnation every night, a swirling vortex of impossible colors and nightmares made manifest. And yet they remained, generation after generation, holding the line against chaos incursions that should have overwhelmed them centuries ago. The inquisitorial transport descended through atmospheric shields and landed in a fortified complex designated as Facility Sigma 7, a black site reserved for interrogating entities too dangerous for conventional imprisonment. Manhattan walked through the landing bay surrounded by inquisitors, servitors, and what appeared to be members of the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guardians, their golden armor marking them as the finest warriors humanity had ever produced. One custodian in particular drew Manhattan's attention. The warrior's armor was inscribed with names, thousands upon thousands of names, each one a being the custodian had personally slain. The warrior's halberd hummed with power that registered as both technological and psychic, a guardian spear capable of killing even greater demons. And unlike the Inquisitors, the custodian showed no fear, no hesitation, no uncertainty, only perfect readiness. "I am Tribune Valerius Meridian," the custodian announced, his voice resonating with authority that transcended mere rank. "By order of the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes and the will of the Master of Mankind himself, you are to be evaluated, catalogued, and assessed for threat level. You will comply." Manhattan noted the phrasing. Not interrogated, like the Inquisitors had threatened, evaluated, as if he were a phenomenon to be studied rather than a prisoner to be broken. Perhaps the Emperor's direct contact had changed their protocols. "I will comply," Manhattan agreed. They led him deeper into the facility, through corridors lined with null field generators that created pockets of psychic silence throughout the complex. Manhattan felt his temporal perception flicker on and off as they passed through these zones, an unpleasant sensation like breathing in irregular gasps. The facility had been designed to contain psychers and demons, entities whose power depended on warp connection. For them, these null zones would be crippling. For Manhattan, they were merely inconvenient. The interrogation chamber was a cathedral of restraint. Chains forged from psychically reactive metals hung from the ceiling, each one inscribed with wards and prayers. A throne of black stone sat at the chamber's center, surrounded by a circle of 13 null field generators that would create an absolute void of psychic energy. Around the chamber's perimeter stood representatives from nearly every major organization in the Imperium. Inquisitors from all three major ordos, Adeptus Mechanicus, tech priests in red robes, ecclesiarchy priests bearing symbols of the Imperial Creed, and even an Astartes in gray armor marked with the symbol of the Exorcist chapter. Space Marines who'd been intentionally possessed by demons and then purged, leaving them uniquely resistant to chaos. Manhattan took the throne without being asked. The chains immediately animated, wrapping around his wrists, ankles, and throat with serpentine intelligence. He allowed them to restrain him, curious about their function. The metal conducted psychic energy, he noted, designed to channel and neutralize warp-based powers. Against a demon, they would serve as both binding and banishment. Against him, they were theater. Tribune Meridian stepped forward, his guardian spear held at rest but ready to strike in a microsecond. "State your designation." "Dr. Jonathan Osterman, also called Dr. Manhattan in my universe of origin." "Your origin is verified as extra-universal?" "Correct. I departed from what you would classify as reality strand Theta 99, according to my analysis of quantum dimensional coordinates. Your universe operates on fundamentally different physical constants, particularly regarding the relationship between consciousness and matter." A tech priest surged forward, his mechadendrites writhing with excitement. "You possess knowledge of extra-universal physics? The Omnissiah's blessing upon this day. You must share this data. The quest for knowledge demands it." "Silence, Magos!" Vicaria snapped. "We are determining threat level, not conducting philosophical debates." The tech priest, Magos Explorator, Theta 97 according to his designation runes, reluctantly stepped back. Though his optical sensors remained locked on Manhattan with unmistakable hunger for information. Tribune Meridian continued his assessment. "You claim to have received direct psychic contact from the Emperor of Mankind. Describe the nature of this contact." Manhattan recounted the exchange precisely, leaving nothing out. The chamber erupted in chaos. Ecclesiarchy priests dropped to their knees in prayer. Inquisitors began arguing in rapid high Gothic about proper interpretation of the Emperor's words. The tech priests started calculating the theological implications. Only Tribune Meridian remained unmoved, his expression carefully neutral. "The Emperor's words will be analyzed by the High Lords of Terra," Meridian stated. "Until they determine his intent, you will remain in this facility under constant observation. Now, address the primary concern. The ruinous powers have made contact with you. Explain why you have not succumbed to corruption." Manhattan considered how to explain quantum determinism to beings who operated on faith-based reasoning. "The entities you call the Chaos Gods function through transactional corruption. They offer power, knowledge, sensation, or endurance in exchange for worship, service, or sacrifice. But I already possess capabilities that exceed their offers, and I do not experience the emotional needs that make their temptations attractive to humans. Tzeentch offers change, but I am already capable of infinite self-modification. Khorne offers strength, but I can manipulate matter at the atomic level. Slaanesh offers sensation, but I perceive reality across all quantum states simultaneously. Nurgle offers acceptance of decay, but I am functionally immortal and can reconstruct myself from complete molecular dispersal. Hubris, one of the Inquisitors muttered, Pride is the first step toward damnation. It is not pride to acknowledge capability, Manhattan replied. I am simply describing my functional parameters. The Exorcist Space Marine stepped forward, his voice a deep rumble through his helmet's Vox grill. I have been possessed by a demon and survived the purging. I know what chaos whispers sound like. They do not begin with grand offers of power. They begin with small compromises, tiny justifications, whispers that tell you your strength makes you special. You claim immunity, but that very claim may be the corruption already taking root. Manhattan examined the Space Marine's molecular structure and detected the scars, psychic wounds where the demon had been torn from his soul, leaving permanent marks in the Astard's spiritual architecture. The warrior spoke from genuine experience. Your concern is noted, Manhattan said carefully, but I do not claim immunity through strength alone. I claim immunity through incompatibility. The chaos gods feed on emotion, belief, and psychic energy. I process reality through quantum observation and mathematical analysis. We are operating in different mediums. The warp cares not for your mathematics, Vakari interjected. It will find a way in. It always does. Then perhaps, Manhattan suggested, my presence here will teach me whether that is true. I am in uncharted territory. Your universe operates on principles mine did not. I may be wrong about my resistance to corruption. If so, I expect you will attempt to destroy me the moment taint is detected. We will succeed, Tribune Meridian stated with absolute certainty. Manhattan doubted that, but saw no benefit in arguing. Instead, he shifted the conversation. I have questions of my own. The Emperor, what is he precisely? I perceive him as human, yet vastly expanded beyond human limitations. Similar to my own transformation, yet fundamentally different in execution? The chamber fell silent. Asking about the Emperor's nature was apparently a grave breach of protocol. Finally, an elderly inquisitor with augmetic eyes and a beard that reached his chest spoke in a voice like grinding stone. The Emperor is the master of mankind, the guardian of humanity, the light in the darkness. He was born in ancient Terra, 10,000 years before the current age, through the sacrifice of thousands of shamans who pooled their souls to create a being powerful enough to guide humanity through the darkness. He is a perpetual, immortal, capable of reincarnation. He is the greatest psyker to ever live. He conquered Terra, unified humanity, and launched the Great Crusade to reclaim the galaxy. He was betrayed by his favored son, Horus, and mortally wounded in the final confrontation. Now he sits upon the golden throne, neither alive nor dead, his psychic might maintaining the Astronomicon that guides our ships through the warp. He is our God, though he denied his divinity. He is our Father, though he cannot speak. He is everything, and we are nothing without him. Manhattan processed this information, a perpetual, functionally immortal psyker who'd been wounded and placed in a life support throne that allowed him to maintain a psychic beacon across the entire galaxy. The faith of quadrillions channeled through that beacon, creating a feedback loop of belief and power that sustained him while simultaneously transforming him into the god he'd claimed not to be. He is dying, Manon, Manhattan observed. The chamber exploded with outrage. Weapons came up, targeting Manhattan from every angle. Tribune Meridian's guardian spear ignited with lethal intent. Heresy! Multiple voices roared. Manhattan remained calm. I can perceive his molecular degradation. The golden throne is failing. His body is consuming itself to maintain the psychic output necessary for the Astronomicon. At current rates of decay, he has perhaps 3,000 years before complete cellular collapse. This is not heresy. This is observable fact. You dare, Vicaria began, but Tribune Meridian raised a hand for silence. He speaks truth, the custodian admitted quietly. The Golden Throne fails by increments. The tech priests of Mars work endlessly to repair what they no longer fully understand. We have perhaps millennia, perhaps less. This is the greatest secret of the Imperium, that our God is dying, and we lack the knowledge to save him. The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. These beings had built an empire on faith in an undying emperor, and now they were confronting the mathematical reality that their God was mortal after all. Manhattan saw an opportunity. I may be able to help. Every eye in the chamber locked onto him with desperate, dangerous intensity. The offer hung in the air for 3 seconds. Manhattan perceived each second as a branching cascade of possible futures. In 43% of timelines, the Imperium rejected his help as heretical interference with the Emperor's divine plan. In 37%, they cautiously accepted but attempted to control every aspect of his involvement. In 15%, they tried to vivisect him to understand his quantum nature. In 5%, they actually listened to what he proposed before making a decision. Tribune Meridian spoke first. Explain what you believe you can accomplish. Manhattan restructured his molecular configuration slightly, making himself more transparent so they could observe the luminescent patterns of energy flowing through his form. The Emperor's deterioration is cellular and psychic simultaneously. His physical body is being consumed to fuel his psychic output, but the Golden Throne's technology cannot fully compensate for the energy differential. I can perceive the throne's mechanisms at the atomic level. I can identify failures in its architecture. I can potentially restructure failing components or supplement the Emperor's cellular regeneration with matter manipulation. You would touch the God Emperor himself? An ecclesiarchy priest gasped, his face pale with horror. You would lay your Xenos hands upon the most sacred? I am not Xenos, Manhattan interrupted with the same calm he'd maintained throughout. I was human. I remain human in origin, though transformed, and I am offering assistance, not demanding the opportunity. You may refuse. Megos Theta 97's mechadendrites practically vibrated with excitement. The Omnissia's wisdom manifests, an extra-universal entity with atomic manipulation capabilities and no corruption vector. This is the answer to 10,000 years of prayers. We must transport him to Mars immediately. We must do nothing of the sort, Vicaria cut in coldly. This creature claims immunity to chaos corruption, speaks of the Emperor's mortality as though it were a simple engineering problem, and now offers to repair the master of mankind like he were some malfunctioning servitor. Every word is potential heresy wrapped in helpful intention. Yet the Emperor spoke to him directly, Tribune Meridian observed. The master of mankind does not waste consciousness on irrelevant entities. If he reached out, he saw value or threat worth acknowledging. The custodian turned his full attention to Manhattan, and for the first time since his transformation, Manhattan felt something approximating intimidation. This warrior had been genetically crafted by the Emperor himself, trained for centuries, and given purpose beyond normal human comprehension. Every molecule of his being was dedicated to protecting humanity's God sovereign. Tell me truthfully, Dr. Manhattan, Meridian said, his voice dropping to a register that demanded honesty. Do you care whether the Emperor lives or dies? Do you care whether humanity survives or falls to chaos? Or is this merely curiosity, an experiment to satisfy your quantum detachment? Manhattan considered lying. He could construct a response that would appeal to their values, claim he'd been moved by humanity's suffering, profess dedication to their cause, but he'd never been skilled at deception, even before his transformation. After, when he could perceive the quantum states of truth and falsehood simultaneously, lying had become not just difficult, but aesthetically unpleasing. I do not experience care the way you do, Manhattan admitted. I observe, I analyze. I experience curiosity about phenomena I have not previously encountered. The Emperor is such a phenomenon, a being who achieved transformation through different mechanisms than my own, with different results. If he dies before I can study those mechanisms, knowledge is lost. If the Imperium collapses into chaos, a unique civilization is erased. I do not care in an emotional sense, but I value the preservation of complexity over its reduction to entropy. The chamber fell silent. Manhattan could see the disappointment in their faces. They'd wanted him to be a savior, or at least an ally driven by compatible motivations. Instead, they'd gotten something alien wearing a human shape, motivated by curiosity rather than compassion. At least he's honest, the exorcist Space Marine rumbled. I trust honest monsters over lying angels. An apt assessment, Brother Sergeant Artemis, Meridian agreed. He turned back to Manhattan. Very well. You will be transported to Mars under maximum security, You will be accompanied by myself, Inquisitor Stern, and a full squad of custodians. You will be monitored by 17 different sensor systems at all times. You will not approach the Golden Throne without explicit permission from the Captain General himself. And if at any point you display signs of corruption, deviate from approved protocols, or threaten the Emperor's safety in any way, I will personally reduce you to component atoms with this. He raised his Guardian Spear meaningfully. You believe that weapon can permanently destroy me? Manhattan asked, genuinely curious. This spear was forged by the Emperor's own hand during the Great Crusade. It has slain demon princes, shattered greater demons, and ended beings who claimed immortality. It exists partially in the warp and partially in real space, striking at both body and soul simultaneously. Yes, Dr. Manhattan, I believe it can destroy you. Would you like me to demonstrate? Manhattan calculated the probability that the spear could actually end his existence. The weapon's dual nature would allow it to disrupt both his physical structure and the quantum information pattern that comprised his consciousness. If that pattern were scattered across both real space and the warp simultaneously, he might not be able to reconstitute himself. It was a genuine threat. Demonstration unnecessary, Manhattan replied. I accept your terms. Then we depart immediately, Meridian declared. Magos, prepare the fastest transport to Mars. Inquisitor Stern, coordinate with Ordo Malleus, High Command, and inform them we're bringing an extra-universal entity of unknown power classification into the heart of the Mechanicus cult. And someone bring clothes for this creature. I will not have him standing naked in the presence of the Fabricator General. Manhattan glanced down at his unclothed form. He'd stopped wearing clothing decades ago in his original universe, after Lori had left him and he'd lost any remaining concern for human social conventions. But if clothing would ease his integration here, he could accommodate. What form of clothing is appropriate? He asked. A tech priest stepped forward, his robes rustling with hidden mechanisms. I shall fabricate suitable garments. An entity of your power would be appropriately attired in ceremonial robes befitting an envoy to the Omnissiah's forged temples. I require only your measurements. Ah, but you can manipulate matter, yes? Then simply transmit your desired dimensions and I shall. Magos, stop fawning over the anomaly and get to work, Vicaria snapped. Within the hour, Manhattan stood attired in deep blue robes, embroidered with silver equations that the tech priest claimed were sacred Mechanicus theorems. He suspected they were trying to symbolically bind him to the Omnissiah's will through mathematical theology. But he found the gesture interesting enough to accept. The transport to Mars was a Mechanicus vessel named the Quest for Comprehension, a ship that had been heavily modified with experimental technologies that violated several imperial regulations, but existed in a gray area of religious exemption. The ship's machine spirit, Manhattan found the concept that technology could possess consciousness fascinating, allegedly responded better to prayer and sacred oils than to standard maintenance protocols. Manhattan spent the journey in a sealed chamber, surrounded by null field generators, monitored by sensors and guarded by custodians who never slept. He used the time to observe the crew through the ship's hull, perceiving their individual stories written in their molecular structures. A deck officer who'd lost her family to an orc invasion and joined the Mechanicus to forget. A servitor who'd once been a criminal, lobotomized and repurposed as an organic component for the ship's systems. A tech priest who'd replaced 90% of his body with machinery in pursuit of the Omnissiah's perfection, yet still wept during his private prayers when he thought no one could see. Each human was a tragedy wrapped in desperate purpose, clinging to faith because the alternative was acknowledging the cosmic horror of their existence. The 49th first millennium was hell, and humanity endured it through sheer stubbornness and belief in a dying God. Manhattan found it simultaneously admirable and pointless. But then, he thought the same of Lori's attempts to maintain their relationship, of Dan's costumed heroism, of Ozymandias's utopian schemes. He'd been wrong to dismiss them then. Perhaps he was wrong now, or perhaps not. Understanding human motivation had never been his strength. Mars appeared through the viewport, a red desert planet covered in forged cities, each one a cathedral of industry where technology and theology merged into something both majestic and terrible. The planet's surface glowed with the heat of a million furnaces, and orbital platforms bristled with weapons capable of annihilating entire fleets. This was the heart of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the cult that worshipped the machine god and maintained the Imperium's technology through prayer, ritual, and barely understood science. The quest for comprehension docked at Olympus Mons, a massive forge complex built into Mars's largest volcano. Manhattan was escorted through corridors lined with statues of venerated tech priests who'd made great discoveries or sacrifices in the Omnissiah's name. Their augmetic forms were preserved in bronze and steel, eternal monuments to the quest for knowledge. They entered the chamber of the Fabricator General, the supreme leader of the Mechanicus cult. The chamber was a cathedral of machinery. Pipes and cables formed Gothic arches overhead. Servitors and servo skulls drifted through incense-scented air. And at the chamber's center stood a being more machine than man. Fabricator General Zagreus Kane stood 3 meters tall, his body a baroque fusion of flesh and technology. Dozens of mechadendrites extended from his back, like a metal spider's legs. His eyes were replaced with advanced optical arrays that could perceive across multiple spectrums simultaneously. His voice emerged from a Vox synthesizer that made each word sound like a sacred hymn. "Dr. Manhattan," Kane intoned, his voice resonating through the chamber. "Welcome to Mars. The Omnissiah's mysteries multiply in your presence. You are either his gift to us or his test. We shall determine which." Manhattan met the Fabricator General's optical array without discomfort. "I am neither gift nor test. I am simply a transformed human seeking to understand your universe. I have offered to examine the Golden Throne. Will you permit this? Or have you brought me here to deny the offer?" Kane's mechadendrites writhed in what might have been laughter. "Direct, efficient. I appreciate clarity. Yes, Dr. Manhattan, we will permit your examination. But first, you will submit to analysis. We must understand what you are before we allow you near the Emperor. You will enter our sacred scanning chambers and allow us to observe your quantum nature. This is not negotiable." Manhattan had expected this. "Acceptable. What are your scanning parameters?" "Every parameter we possess," Kane replied, his optical arrays gleaming with hunger for knowledge. "And then we shall invent new ones." The scanning chambers beneath Olympus Mons had been constructed during the Dark Age of technology, an era when humanity's scientific achievements had bordered on the miraculous before collapsing into the old night. The Mechanicus maintained these chambers as sacred relics, using technologies they could operate, but no longer fully comprehended. The walls were lined with crystalline sensors that operated on principles the tech priests called quantum resonance observation and probability field mapping. Manhattan recognized them immediately as crude but functional reality state analyzers. They placed him at the chamber's center, surrounded by a perfect circle of scanning equipment that hummed with barely controlled power. Magos Theta 97 practically vibrated with excitement as he calibrated the instruments, his mechadendrites dancing across control panels with religious fervor. "The Omnissiah's blessing upon this moment," the Magos proclaimed. "We shall witness the fundamental structure of an extra-universal entity. The knowledge gained here will advance the quest for understanding by millennia." "Contain your enthusiasm, Magos," Fabricator General Kane instructed, though Manhattan detected approval in the distortion of his Vox synthesizer. "Begin the scan sequence. I want molecular composition, energy signature analysis, quantum state mapping, and psychic resonance readings. If this entity so much as flickers during the scan, terminate immediately and activate the null field containment." The custodians took positions around the chamber's perimeter, their guardian spears ready. Tribune Meridian stood closest, his gaze never leaving Manhattan's form. "If you attempt to access any Mechanicus systems, interfere with the scanning process, or display hostile intent, I will strike before you complete the action. Understood?" "Understood," Manhattan replied. "Though I should note that your definition of before and mine may differ significantly. I perceive time non-linearly. I have already observed multiple versions of this conversation across branching timelines." "Then you've seen the ones where I kill you," Meridian stated flatly. Yes, they occur in 37% of observed futures, typically triggered by misunderstandings or defensive reflexes rather than actual hostile intent. Comforting, Inquisitor Vicaria muttered from her position near the chamber entrance. She'd insisted on being present despite the Mechanicus's protests about unaugmented humans contaminating their sacred workspace. Perhaps we can focus on the 63% where you don't force us to destroy you? Manhattan nodded and the scanning began. The sensation was unusual. The crystalline sensors projected fields that intersected his molecular structure, reading the quantum signatures of his constituent particles. He could feel them cataloging his atomic composition, the hydrogen that formed the basis of organic chemistry, the carbon chains, the exotic particles that shouldn't exist in stable configurations but did because his consciousness held them in place through sheer observation. The tech priests erupted in binaric cant, rapid-fire streams of code that served as their sacred language. Manhattan decoded it automatically. They were detecting impossibilities. His atomic structure violated thermodynamic principles. His energy signature suggested he was drawing power from a source that didn't exist in this universe. His quantum state existed in superposition across multiple probability fields simultaneously. Impossible, Magos Theta 97 breathed, switching back to Gothic. His molecular bonds should collapse immediately. There is no electromagnetic force maintaining cohesion. He is holding himself together through conscious observation alone. The Omnissiah's wisdom manifests. He is a being of pure will given physical form. Not quite, Manhattan corrected. My consciousness is the observation function that collapses quantum possibilities into fixed states. My will determines which states become reality within my body. It is not metaphysical. It is simply quantum mechanics extended beyond normal boundaries. Fabricator General Kane leaned forward, his optical arrays adjusting to perceive Manhattan across 17 different spectrums simultaneously. And what provides the energy for this process? Matter manipulation at quantum scales requires immense power. Where is your source? I generate my own through matter-energy conversion, Einstein's famous equation, E or mc2. I can convert matter into energy and energy into matter with perfect efficiency. I am, essentially, a closed system that maintains its own existence. The chamber fell silent except for the humming of machinery. Finally, Kane spoke in a voice that carried something almost like reverence. You are a perpetual motion machine. The Omnissiah's first law states that entropy always increases, yet you exist in defiance of that law. You are an abomination, Vicarius applied coldly, or a miracle. The distinction often proves meaningless. Manhattan perceived a shift in the chamber's atmosphere, metaphorically but also literally, as several tech priests redirected their breathing apparatus to release different combinations of sacred incense. They were preparing for something, a ritual perhaps, or a test. Continue the scan, Kane ordered. I want psychic resonance readings. Determine if he registers as a psyker, a demon, or something entirely unprecedented. New instruments activated. Crystalline devices that probe not his physical structure, but the space around him, searching for connections to the warp. Manhattan felt the scanning fields brush against his consciousness like fingers seeking purchase on glass. The warp was there, always present in this universe like background radiation, but Manhattan's connection to it was wrong. Anomalous readings, a tech priest reported, his voice distorted by static. Subject displays zero conventional psychic signature, yet warp currents bend around him like gravity wells bending light. He is not psyker, not blank, not null. He is awareness without connection, observation without participation. Clarify, Kane demanded. Manhattan decided to explain it himself. In my universe, consciousness is an emergent property of complex quantum systems. Here, consciousness directly interacts with the warp, the realm of emotion and thought given substance. But my consciousness was formed in a universe without the warp. I observe it, I can perceive it, but I am not connected to it the way your psychers are. I am like a scientist studying a foreign ecosystem, present within it, but not part of its food chain. Yet the chaos gods spoke to you, Tribune Meridian interjected. They perceived you as prey or potential servant. They would not waste attention on something truly outside their influence. They perceive me as anomalous, Manhattan agreed, something that shouldn't exist by their rules. That makes me interesting to them, worth attempting to corrupt. But their corruption requires hooks, emotional vulnerabilities, desires, fears, beliefs. I possess none of these in forms they can manipulate. I am intellectually curious about their nature, but curiosity is not the same as desire. A new voice interrupted, not from anyone in the chamber, but from the equipment itself. The Vox speakers crackled with interference, and through the static emerged a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Curiosity is the doorway to knowledge, and knowledge is my domain, little observer. Every tech priest in the chamber immediately began chanting prayers and activating protective wards. The custodian's guardian spears ignited with golden fire. Inquisitor Vicaria drew her bolt pistol and began loading specialized rounds that reeked of blessed oils and psychic amplification. Manhattan recognized the voice immediately. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, the architect of fate, the chaos god of sorcery, scheming, and impossible knowledge. The air in the chamber rippled, and colors that had no names in human language began bleeding through reality. A presence pressed against the scanning chamber's walls, not physically present, but reaching through from the warp with enough force to make reality buckle under the pressure. You are magnificent, Tzeentch's voice slithered through the Vox speakers, each word carrying layers of meaning that Manhattan could parse, but the humans could only experience as overwhelming wrongness. A being of pure observation, untainted by emotion, unbound by fate. Do you know how rare that is? Even the Emperor, for all his power, is shackled to his species' survival. But you could observe the death of this universe with the same detachment you observe the creation of a new star. That detachment is beautiful. That clarity is precious. And I would very much like to see what you become when you finally admit that your curiosity is not so different from my hunger for change. Manhattan perceived the chaos god's true form in the warp, a roiling mass of probability and possibility, constantly shifting, never settling into a single configuration. Tzeentch was change incarnate, and therefore fundamentally opposed to Manhattan's nature as a being who could fix quantum states through observation. I have no interest in your offers, Manhattan stated calmly. I make no offers, little blue god. I simply observe, as you do. I observe that you have traveled across universes seeking something your previous reality could not provide. I observe that you came to this universe specifically because it contains phenomena that defy your understanding. I observe that you are about to place your hands upon the Emperor himself to examine the very mechanism by which he maintains his hold on humanity. And I observe that such an examination will inevitably reveal secrets that will change everything. The word change resonated through the chamber like a bell tolling, and Manhattan felt something unprecedented. The timelines he'd been observing split into completely contradictory configurations. In some futures, touching the Emperor would reveal nothing significant. In others, it would trigger a psychic catastrophe. In still others, it would begin a transformation in Manhattan himself that he couldn't predict because the variables involved transcended his understanding. For the first time since his transformation, Dr. Manhattan encountered genuine uncertainty about his own future. "Begone, abomination!" Fabricator General Kane roared, activating every protective system in the chamber simultaneously. Null field generators flared to life, creating zones of psychic void that pushed the warp presence back. Blessed icons began broadcasting prayers in Benaric cant. The machine spirit of Olympus Mons itself seemed to awaken, adding its will to the banishment. Tzeentch's laughter echoed through the static as his presence withdrew, but his final words lingered. "Enjoy your examination, Dr. Manhattan. I certainly will." The chamber fell silent. Manhattan stood unchanged at its center, but the tech priests were frantically checking readings. The custodians maintained combat readiness, and Inquisitor Vicaria had her bolt pistol aimed directly at Manhattan's head. "Explain," she demanded. "Explain why a chaos god just manifested in the most heavily warded facility on Mars, specifically to speak to you." Manhattan considered the question. Sinch perceives me as a variable that could alter established patterns. I represent change in a universe where change is his domain. He wants to observe what I will do, particularly regarding the Emperor. My examination of the Golden Throne interests him. Then the examination is canceled, Tribune Meridian declared. If the ruinous powers want you near the Emperor, that alone is reason to deny access. Alternatively, Magos Theta 97 interjected nervously, the architect of fate fears what Dr. Manhattan might accomplish. Perhaps the examination should proceed precisely because Zinch attempted to discourage it through intimidation? That's exactly the kind of reverse psychology trap a chaos god would set, Vicaria countered. We cannot trust any course of action that emerges from contact with the ruinous powers. Fabricator General Kane raised a mechadendrite for silence. The decision is not ours alone to make. This matter must be brought before the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes in the High Lords of Terra. Dr. Manhattan will remain in containment while we deliberate. Tribune, ensure he remains secured. Inquisitor, coordinate with your Ordo. Magos, compile all scanning data and prepare for immediate transmission to Terra. As the chamber cleared and Manhattan was led back to his containment cell, he reflected on Sinch's words. The Chaos God had been correct. Manhattan was curious about what would happen when he examined the Emperor. That curiosity was his primary motivation, but Sinch had implied that curiosity was functionally identical to the god's own nature. Was that true? Was Manhattan's detached observation really so different from Sinch's endless scheming? Both involved manipulating variables to observe outcomes. Both prioritized knowledge over morality. Both existed outside conventional emotional frameworks. For the first time in decades, Dr. Manhattan experienced something approaching self-doubt. It was an unpleasant sensation, but also interesting. The containment cell they assigned Manhattan was a perfect cube, 10 meters on each side, carved from a single block of psychically inert stone, mined from a moon that had never known life. Null field generators hummed in each corner, creating overlapping zones of warp suppression. The only entrance was sealed behind 3 separate doors, each locked with mechanisms that required biological, mechanical, and psychic authorization simultaneously. Outside, a full squad of custodians maintained eternal vigil. It was, by the Imperium's standards, the most secure prison cell in existence. Manhattan could have left at any moment by dispersing his molecules through the stone or simply teleporting outside the facility entirely, but he chose to remain. The containment was theater, a demonstration that the Imperium still believed it had control over the situation. Shattering that illusion would only complicate matters. Besides, the cell gave him time to think. He spent 3 days, as measured by Mars's rotation, observing the facility around him. Through the stone walls across the kilometers of forged temples and industrial complexes, he perceived the Mechanicus cult going about their sacred work. They prayed to machines and machines prayed back in their own way. The machine spirits responding to devotion with slightly improved performance that shouldn't be possible but was. Another instance of belief affecting reality. In his universe, machines were deterministic. A computer operated according to its programming, physics, and electrical current. Here, a computer operated according to those same principles, plus the faith of its users and the temperament of its machine spirit. It was inefficient, irrational, and absolutely fascinating. The Mechanicus had turned engineering into theology and somehow made it work. On the 4th day, Tribune Meridian entered the cell alone. His guardian spear held in a rest position that could shift to combat readiness in less than a second. The Captain General has reviewed your case, the custodian announced. You will be permitted to examine the Golden Throne under the following conditions. You will be accompanied by myself and 4 other custodians at all times. You will be granted exactly 1 hour of examination. You will touch nothing without explicit permission. You will explain every observation in real time. And at the first sign of chaos taint, hostile action, or deviation from approved protocol, we will end you. Are these terms acceptable? Yes. Meridian studied Manhattan for a long moment. You agreed too quickly. Why? Because the terms are reasonable, given your limited understanding of what I am. You are attempting to protect your emperor while gathering information about an unknown entity. The restrictions you've imposed serve that purpose adequately. You don't resent being treated as a threat? I am a threat, Manhattan replied simply. I can manipulate matter at quantum scales. I am functionally immortal. I have been contacted directly by chaos entities, and my presence here represents a variable you cannot predict or control. You would be foolish not to treat me as a threat. I respect competence. Your threat assessment is competent. Something shifted in Meridian's stance. Not relaxation, but a fractional decrease in tension. The Captain General said you would say something like that. He believes you are exactly what you claim to be, a transformed human driven by curiosity rather than malice. I am less convinced, but I have my orders. You believe I will betray the Imperium's trust? I believe you will do what serves your curiosity and that may or may not align with humanity's survival. That makes you unreliable as an ally and unpredictable as an enemy, the most dangerous kind of entity. Manhattan considered this assessment and found it accurate. What would convince you of my reliability? Nothing, Meridian stated flatly. I am a custodian. I trust only the Emperor and my brothers. Everyone else is a potential threat to be managed. You are simply a more interesting threat than most. The custodian turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. We depart for Terra in 1 hour. There is a matter you should understand before we arrive. The Emperor is not merely a being on life support. He is the keystone holding together an empire of 1,000,000 worlds. His presence in the warp creates the Astronomicon that guides our ships. His will holds the webway gate beneath the palace sealed against demonic invasion. His psychic might shields humanity from chaos predation. If you damage him, even accidentally, you will not die quickly. The Captain General will ensure your destruction takes centuries and involves pain beyond your comprehension. I tell you this not as a threat, but as a promise. Manhattan met the custodian's gaze without fear. I understand the stakes. I will take appropriate precautions. After Meridian left, Manhattan returned to his observations. But now he focused specifically on Terra, perceiving it across the vast distance of space. The homeworld of humanity burned with psychic energy, billions of souls all generating faith-based power that funneled through the Emperor's dying form. The Golden Throne sat beneath the Imperial Palace, a massive arcane mechanism that was part technology, part psychic amplifier, part prison holding back the howling infinity of the warp. And at the center of it all, the Emperor himself, a being so bright in Manhattan's perception that looking directly at him was like staring into a star. But unlike a star, which was merely fusion and plasma, the Emperor's light was consciousness magnified a trillionfold. He perceived the entire galaxy simultaneously, his attention distributed across 1,000,000 threats, 1,000,000,000 prayers, 1,000,000,000,000 moments of human suffering and triumph. Manhattan had thought himself the most aware being in his original universe. He'd been wrong. The Emperor's awareness dwarfed his own, spread so thin across such vast distances that no single moment received his full attention. Yet each moment received enough to matter. It was magnificent and horrifying, because Manhattan could see what that constant expansion of consciousness was doing to the man who'd once been human. The Emperor was being consumed by his own power, stretched across infinity until the individual personality that had conquered Terra and launched the Great Crusade was barely recognizable beneath the weight of godhood he'd never wanted. The journey to Terra took 6 days through the warp, a relatively short voyage thanks to the Astronomicon's guidance and the navigator's skill. Manhattan spent the voyage isolated in his quarters, surrounded by custodians and nullfields, observing the Immaterium's chaos through the hull of the ship. The warp was beautiful in its absolute wrongness. Physics were suggestions here, causality was optional, and emotions had weight and substance. Manhattan watched demons form from concentrated anger or desire, watched them hunt for ships to board and souls to corrupt. He observed the 4 chaos gods in their domains, Korn's brass citadels built from rage, Tzeentch's impossible libraries containing forbidden knowledge, Nurgle's gardens of decay where plague and acceptance merged, Slaanesh's palaces of sensation where pleasure and pain became indistinguishable. And he observed the Emperor's light cutting through it all like a golden sword, creating a narrow corridor of relative safety through which Imperial ships could navigate. It was an act of will so constant, so absolute, that Manhattan couldn't conceive how the Emperor maintained it. The psychic effort should have burned out any consciousness instantly, but the Emperor had been doing this for 10,000 years. When they emerged from the warp above Terra, Manhattan's perception was immediately overwhelmed. The homeworld of humanity was a hive of consciousness, countless billions of minds all radiating faith, fear, hope, and desperation in equal measure. The planet's surface was covered entirely in cityscape, layer upon layer of habitation stacked kilometers high. The Imperial Palace dominated the horizon, a mountain of architecture larger than entire continents, topped with cathedrals that scraped the edge of space, and beneath it all, the Golden Throne. Manhattan was escorted through the palace by a procession of custodians, inquisitors, tech priests, and ecclesiarchy officials, each faction sending representatives to observe what happened when an extra-universal entity approached their god. They passed through corridors lined with statues of imperial heroes, through chambers where the High Lords of Terra debated policy that affected trillions, through temples where millions came to pray. Finally, they descended, down past the palace foundations, down through ancient tunnels carved during the Age of Strife, down into the very bedrock of Terra itself. The temperature rose with each level, not from geothermal activity, but from the psychic energy radiating from the chamber below. The throne room. They emerged into a cavern so vast Manhattan couldn't perceive its far walls, even with his enhanced senses. The ceiling was lost in darkness, punctuated by lights that might have been stars or might have been souls trapped in the architecture. And at the chamber's center, sitting upon a throne of golden machinery that pulsed with barely contained power, was the master of mankind. The Emperor was a corpse. That was Manhattan's first impression. The body on the throne was desiccated, mummified, skin stretched over bones that should have collapsed millennia ago. Tubes and cables penetrated the flesh, feeding nutrients, removing waste, circulating fluids through a cardiovascular system that barely functioned. The face was a skull covered in parchment-thin skin, eye sockets deep and dark. But the psychic presence was overwhelming. Manhattan perceived the Emperor existing simultaneously as corpse and god, dying and eternal, individual and gestalt. The man who'd walked Terra in ancient times was still present. Manhattan could see memories burned into the quantum structure of those ancient neurons. But layered on top of that individual consciousness were a million years of accumulated human faith, belief given substance and force, transforming Jonathan Osterman's fellow transformed human into something that transcended humanity entirely. The Emperor's awareness turned toward Manhattan, and for the second time since arriving in this universe, Dr. Manhattan felt small. "I perceive you," the Emperor's thoughts thundered directly into Manhattan's consciousness, not words, pure meaning compressed into concept. "You perceive me. We are similar. We are different. You wish to examine my prison? You may begin." Manhattan stepped forward, and every weapon in the chamber tracked his movement. He approached the Golden Throne carefully, extending his perception to examine its mechanisms without physically touching anything yet. The throne was a masterwork of Dark Age technology fused with psychic amplification systems and what appeared to be modified Xenos technology, likely Eldar, judging by the crystalline components. It was designed to contain a psyker, amplify their power, and direct that power toward specific purposes, maintaining the Astronomicon, holding the Webway Gate sealed, projecting the Emperor's will across the galaxy. But it was failing, catastrophically. Manhattan could see microfractures in critical components, degradation in the psychic focusing crystals, power fluctuations that suggested the whole system was running far beyond its design parameters. The throne had been built to contain a powerful psyker for a few years at most. It had been forced to contain the most powerful psyker in human history for 10,000 years. "It's breaking," Manhattan said aloud, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Not immediately. You have centuries remaining, possibly millennia. But the failure is inevitable without intervention. Can you repair it?" That was Captain General Trajan Valoris himself, the leader of the Adeptus Custodes, his voice heavy with the weight of 10,000 years of failure to save his master. Manhattan examined the throne's structure more closely, tracing power flows and energy pathways. The damage is too extensive for simple repair, but I may be able to reinforce critical systems, slow the degradation. The question is whether such intervention would be welcome. He turned his attention to the Emperor directly. You are dying because this machine cannot sustain you indefinitely. But you are also transforming, becoming something beyond the human who first sat upon this throne. If I stabilize the throne's mechanisms, I may prevent that transformation from completing. Is that what you want? The chamber fell absolutely silent. Even the machine's spirits seemed to hold their breath. The Emperor's response came slowly, each word weighted with infinite consideration. I do not know. The Emperor's admission of uncertainty rippled through the throne room like a psychic shockwave. Several tech priests collapsed, their augmetic systems overloading from the emotional feedback. An ecclesiarchy cardinal dropped to his knees, weeping openly. Even the custodians shifted uncomfortably. Their master, the being who had guided humanity for 40,000 years, had just confessed doubt. Manhattan found the honesty refreshing. You have been sustaining this for 10 millennia, Manhattan observed, still examining the throne's mechanisms. You maintain the Astronomicon, seal the Webway Gate, and project your consciousness across the galaxy. But the effort is consuming you. The man you were is being burned away to fuel the god you're becoming, and you don't know if that transformation should be completed or prevented. Correct, the Emperor responded. When I sat upon this throne, I was still predominantly human. I had hopes, plans, a vision for humanity's future. Now, I am attention without identity, purpose without personality. I guide a million worlds but cannot remember why I began this crusade. Manhattan perceived the Emperor's fractured consciousness more clearly now. The being before him was fragmented across impossibly vast scales. Part of him maintained the Astronomicon, part sealed the Webway, part monitored 1,000 warfronts, part answered prayers, part wrestled with demons in the warp. There was no unified emperor anymore, just countless sub-processes running in parallel, each handling a different aspect of the Imperium's survival. You have become what you denied being, Manhattan said quietly. They call you a god. You are functionally operating as one. Yes, I denied my divinity. I sought to free humanity from superstition and faith, but faith became humanity's greatest weapon against chaos. Their belief in me sustains me. Their prayers strengthen me. I became the god I never wanted to be because the alternative was humanity's extinction. Fabricator General Kane stepped forward, his mechadendrites trembling with agitation. Dr. Manhattan, you claimed you could slow the throne's degradation. Can this be accomplished without harming the Emperor? Manhattan traced the energy pathways through the throne's crystalline matrices. I can restructure failing components at the molecular level, reinforce fractures, optimize power distribution. But there's a complication. The throne isn't just failing mechanically, it's failing because the Emperor's power output has exceeded its design parameters. Every year, his psychic might grows as more humans are born to feed him faith. The throne was built for a powerful psyker. It now contains something approaching a god. No repair can permanently solve that disparity. Then what would you propose? Captain General Valoris demanded, his guardian spear crackling with barely suppressed energy. We cannot simply allow the throne to fail. Manhattan turned to face the assembled representatives of the Imperium. You have three options. First, I reinforce the throne, buying you additional centuries but ultimately delaying the inevitable. Second, I attempt to reverse engineer the throne's technology and construct a superior replacement, which would require removing the Emperor from the current throne, a process that would likely kill him and doom the Imperium. Third, I examine whether the Emperor actually needs the throne anymore. The chamber erupted in chaos. Heresy! Multiple voices roared simultaneously. He suggests we remove the Emperor from his throne? This creature understands nothing of the stakes. The Webway Gate would open. The demons would pour through. The Astronomicon would fail. Every ship in the warp would be lost. Tribune Meridian's voice cut through the din like a blade. Silence. Let him explain. Manhattan waited for the chamber to quiet before continuing. The emperor sat upon the throne because he was mortally wounded and needed life support. The throne sustained his body while amplifying his psychic power for specific purposes. But I perceive that his consciousness is no longer entirely dependent on his physical form. The faith of humanity has created a psychic construct, a god entity in the warp that uses the emperor's body as an anchor point but exists semi-independently. It's possible that removing him from the throne would allow that psychic entity to fully manifest. You propose we kill the emperor so his soul can become a true chaos god? Inquisitor Vicaria's voice was cold with lethal intent. That is the most elaborate heresy I have ever encountered. Not a chaos god, Manhattan corrected. The emperor's psychic presence in the warp is fundamentally opposed to chaos. He would become something different, an order entity perhaps. A fifth chaos god defined by humanity's need for meaning, structure, and survival, rather than emotion run wild. Magos Theta, 9/7's optical arrays blazed with sudden realization. The Star Child prophecy, ancient texts speak of the Emperor's soul being reborn. If what Dr. Manhattan suggests is true, it is speculation built on speculation, Valoris interrupted. We cannot risk the Imperium's survival on a theory proposed by an entity we've known for mere weeks. Dr. Manhattan, you will proceed with option 1. Reinforce the throne. Extend our timeline. That is your mandate. Manhattan perceived the futures branching from this decision. In most timelines, his reinforcement of the throne bought the Imperium between 300 and 800 additional years. In a few timelines, his intervention introduced unforeseen complications that accelerated the failure. In none of the timelines he could observe did the Imperium survive indefinitely, but something was interfering with his perception. The futures beyond his reinforcement of the throne were hazy, obscured by what he now recognized as warp interference. Tzeentch was watching this moment with intense interest, and the Chaos God's attention was clouding the timeline itself. I will comply, Manhattan agreed, but I require the Emperor's permission. Every eye in the chamber turned to the corpse on the throne. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the Emperor's desiccated lips moved fractionally, and a single word emerged. Not psychically, but physically. Forcing air through a throat that hadn't spoken in millennia. Proceed. The word came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried absolute authority. The single syllable had required an enormous effort from a being who routinely projected his consciousness across light years. The Emperor had withdrawn enough attention from his galaxy-spanning duties to speak aloud, and that withdrawal had consequences. Somewhere in the galaxy, a ship had just lost the Astronomican's guidance. A demon had breached a weakened psychic barrier. A prayer had gone unanswered. Manhattan understood the message. The Emperor had paid a cost to grant permission. That permission should not be wasted. He approached the throne and placed his hands directly on the golden mechanisms. Immediately, he perceived the full scope of the technology's complexity. The throne was simultaneously a life support system, a psychic amplifier, a warp real space interface, and a prison. It penetrated the Emperor's body at 17,000 distinct points, each connection serving multiple functions. Manhattan began his work. He started with the crystalline psychic focusing arrays, restructuring their molecular lattices to remove accumulated stress fractures. The crystals began glowing brighter, their efficiency increasing by approximately 11%. Next, he addressed the power distribution conduits, optimizing their conductive properties and removing blockages caused by 10,000 years of continuous operation. As he worked, Manhattan became aware of something unexpected. The throne wasn't just technology, it was partially alive. Not in the biological sense, but in the way that sufficiently complex systems could develop emergent behaviors. The throne had a machine spirit, and that spirit was in agony. The realization surprised him. Manhattan had dismissed the Mechanicus's machine spirit theology as superstition, but now he perceived it directly. The throne's control systems had developed a form of consciousness over millennia of operation, and that consciousness was trapped, forced to witness the Emperor's suffering while being unable to do anything but maintain the status quo. Manhattan addressed the machine spirit directly, restructuring neural pathways in the throne's quantum computational matrices. I can give you options you didn't have before. Adjustments to power flow, alternative configurations. Will you work with me? The response came as a surge of electromagnetic activity that Manhattan's consciousness translated into desperate affirmation. The throne's machine spirit began feeding him diagnostic data, highlighting failure points, suggesting modifications, essentially collaborating with Manhattan to optimize its own systems. The tech priest noticed immediately. The throne's machine spirit is communing with him. Magos Theta 97 gasped. Blessed Omnissiah, it recognizes him as sacred. Manhattan ignored the commentary and continued working. He reinforced structural components, replaced degraded materials by restructuring nearby matter into appropriate configurations, and rebuilt entire subsystems that had been jury-rigged with inadequate repairs over the centuries. Hours passed. The assembled observers maintained their vigil, none daring to interrupt. Manhattan lost himself in the technical challenge, finding satisfaction in solving a puzzle that had defied the Imperium's best minds for 10 millennia. Finally, he stepped back. It's done. The throne's structural integrity has been restored to approximately 70% of original specifications. Power efficiency has increased by 14%. Critical systems have been reinforced against cascade failure. The throne should function reliably for at least another 500 years, possibly longer if the Mechanicus maintains what I've rebuilt. Captain General Valoris approached the throne, his guardian spear lowered. And the Emperor? Have you harmed him in any way? Manhattan examined the Emperor's form. His physical body is unchanged. His psychic output has stabilized. The throne is no longer losing efficiency, so he requires less power to maintain the same functions. The strain on his consciousness should be marginally reduced. Confirmed, the Emperor's psychic voice resonated through the chamber. The burden is lighter, not enough to matter in the grand scale, but measurable. You have my gratitude, Dr. Manhattan. I require no gratitude. This was an exchange of knowledge. I learned about your technology and psychic mechanics. You gained extended operational capacity. Both parties benefit. Tribune Meridian studied Manhattan carefully. You spent 17 hours working on the most sacred mechanism in the Imperium. You could have introduced sabotage, installed hidden controls, or corrupted the machine spirit. Why didn't you? Why would I? Such actions would serve no purpose. I came to observe and understand, not to destroy or control. You continue to assess me as if I possess hidden, malicious intent. I don't. My motivations are exactly as I've described them: curiosity and the acquisition of knowledge. And what have you learned? Valoris asked. Manhattan considered the question. I've learned that belief can create reality in this universe in ways my original cosmos could never support. I've learned that consciousness can be distributed across such vast scales that individual identity becomes meaningless. I've learned that your Emperor made a choice: sacrifice his humanity to become humanity's shield. It was not a good choice or a bad choice. It was simply the only choice that led to species survival. And I've learned that even beings of immense power eventually face problems they cannot solve through power alone. He paused, then added quietly, that last lesson is particularly relevant to my own situation. Inquisitor Vicarius stepped forward. What do you mean? I have spent decades believing my transformation made me effectively omnipotent within my universe's physical constraints. But omnipotence is contextual. In my universe, I could manipulate matter and energy at will. Here I can do the same, but the warp introduces variables I cannot fully control. The Emperor is vastly more powerful than me in psychic terms, yet he is trapped by his own power, unable to act freely because every action has costs measured in human lives. Power without wisdom is merely capability. The Emperor has wisdom. I'm beginning to suspect I do not. The chamber fell silent. No one had expected the extra universal entity to confess uncertainty. Finally, the Emperor spoke once more. You learn quickly. That is good, because I have a request to make of you, Dr. Manhattan, and it will require more than power to fulfill. The Emperor's words hung in the air, like a pronouncement of fate. Manhattan perceived the futures, branching wildly from this moment, more chaotic than anything he'd observed since arriving in this universe. Whatever the Emperor was about to request, it represented a nexus point where timelines diverged so drastically that Manhattan couldn't predict which would manifest. Sinch's laughter echoed faintly through the warp, barely perceptible but unmistakably present. The Chaos God was watching this moment with ravenous attention. "What is your request?" Manhattan asked. The Emperor's consciousness focused more tightly, withdrawing attention from 1,000 other tasks to concentrate on this single conversation. Somewhere in the galaxy, another ship lost guidance. Another demon broke through weakened defenses. Another prayer went unanswered. The cost of the Emperor's focus was measured in human suffering, but he paid it anyway. The webway, the Emperor's thoughts projected directly into Manhattan's mind. Beneath this palace lies a gate into the Elder's ancient network, a system of tunnels through the warp that allows instantaneous travel without true warp exposure. I attempted to claim it for humanity, to free us from dependence on navigators and the Astronomicon, to give us safe passage through the galaxy. Manhattan perceived the gate the Emperor referenced, a massive portal sealed by psychic force, located in chambers directly beneath the throne room. And beyond that seal, he perceived chaos. The gate had been breached during the Horus Heresy, allowing demons to pour through. The Emperor had been forced to seal it with his own psychic might, and that seal had required constant maintenance for 10,000 years. The seal holds, but barely. Every century it weakens. I devote enormous power to maintaining it, power that could be used elsewhere. If the seal fails, demons will flood Terra. The Imperium will fall. "You want me to reinforce the seal?" Manhattan concluded. "No. I want you to permanently close the gate, sever the connection between the webway and Terra, make it so I no longer need to maintain the seal." Captain General Valoris stepped forward immediately. "My lord, with respect, that would abandon your great work. The Imperial Webway project was to be humanity's salvation. The project failed 10,000 years ago. I maintain a seal on a broken dream, while humanity suffers for want of my attention elsewhere. It is time to admit defeat and allocate resources more effectively." The admission struck the assembled observers like a physical blow. The Emperor, the master of mankind, the architect of the Great Crusade, the being who'd never accepted failure, was acknowledging that his greatest project had been a mistake. Manhattan examined the webway gate more closely, perceiving its structure across multiple dimensions. The gate existed partially in real space and partially in the warp, creating a stable interface between dimensions. Closing it permanently would require severing that connection in a way that couldn't be reopened from either side. "It's possible," Manhattan said slowly, "but there are complications. The gate is integrated into Terra's structure at a fundamental level. Closing it incorrectly could destabilize the planet's dimensional stability. And there's another issue. The demons on the other side of your seal won't simply accept closure. They'll fight to keep the gate open. I would need to enter the webway itself to close it properly." "Correct. You would enter the compromised sections of the webway, you would face demonic opposition, and you would need to collapse the tunnel behind you as you retreat. It is dangerous even for an entity of your capabilities." "Why ask me? Surely the Imperium has its own specialists, all of whom would be corrupted within minutes of exposure to that level of warp saturation. You, Dr. Manhattan, have demonstrated resistance to chaos corruption. Your quantum-based consciousness appears incompatible with warp-based manipulation. You are uniquely suited for this task." Manhattan calculated the probabilities. In 63% of observed futures, he successfully closed the gate. In 28%, he failed and was forced to retreat. In 9%, something unexpected occurred that he couldn't predict due to warp interference. In less than 1%, he was corrupted or destroyed. But that less than 1% troubled him. In his original universe, his precognition had been perfect. Here, these gaps in prediction represented genuine unknowns, situations where his quantum observation failed to provide reliable data. "I will do it," Manhattan decided, "but I have conditions." Tribune Meridian's guardian spear rose slightly. "You dare place conditions on a request from the Emperor himself?" "The Emperor requested, not commanded," Manhattan replied calmly. That implies negotiation is acceptable. My conditions are simple. First, I want complete access to all Mechanicus data on the webway structure and the nature of the breach. Second, I want a detailed explanation of how the warp affects consciousness at extended exposure levels. Third, if I succeed in closing the gate, I want freedom to continue my observations throughout the Imperium without further restriction. The first two conditions are acceptable, the Emperor responded. The third requires clarification. What restrictions do you find burdensome? I am constantly monitored, constantly escorted, constantly assessed as a threat. I understand the necessity, but it limits my ability to observe your Imperium authentically. If I successfully complete this task, I want the freedom to travel where I wish, observe what I wish, without constant military escort. The chamber erupted in immediate protest. Inquisitors, custodians, and tech priests all shouted objections simultaneously. The idea of allowing an extra-universal entity unrestricted access to the Imperium was apparently unthinkable. The Emperor's psychic presence silenced them all with a single pulse of absolute authority. If you close the gate and prove your resistance to chaos corruption through extended exposure, you will be granted greater freedom of movement. Not unrestricted. Some locations must remain sealed even to you, but substantially more freedom than you currently possess. Acceptable? Manhattan considered. The Emperor was offering a compromise. Trust, but verified. Freedom, but monitored. It was more reasonable than he'd expected. Acceptable. Then, prepare yourself. The gate will be opened within the hour. You will enter the webway, proceed to the breach point, and collapse the tunnel permanently. Custodians will accompany you as far as they can before the warp saturation becomes lethal to normal humans. After that point, you proceed alone. Magos Theta 9. 7 surged forward, his mechadendrites producing data slates and hololithic displays. I shall provide comprehensive briefing on webway architecture. The ancient text described the Eldar construction methods. Though much is fragmentary, the tunnels exist in a dimensional membrane between real space and the warp proper, held stable through psychic architecture and exotic materials. The breach occurred when... Magos, summarize, Captain General Valoris commanded. We have limited time. The tech priest's disappointment was palpable, but he complied. The webway is a network of stable tunnels through the warp. Demons cannot normally enter because the tunnel's dimensional barriers exclude warp entities. However, when Magnus the Red attempted to warn the Emperor about Horus's betrayal, he shattered the barriers protecting Terra's section of the webway. Demons poured through. The Emperor has held them back ever since, but the corrupted sections are now saturated with chaos energy. You will face not just demons, but the webway structure itself attempting to reject your presence as incompatible with its original design. Manhattan absorbed this information. The webway will try to expel me? Potentially, it was built by the Eldar, who use psychic harmonics tuned to their specific consciousness patterns. Your quantum-based awareness may register as hostile intrusion, or it may not. We genuinely do not know. Comforting, Manhattan observed dryly. The preparations proceeded with military efficiency. Custodians armed themselves with specialized weapons designed for demon fighting. Tech priests blessed equipment and chanted prayers to machine spirits. Inquisitors prepared psychic wards and sanctified oils. Manhattan required no equipment, no blessings, no armor. He would enter as he was, a naked blue figure walking into literal hell. Inquisitor Vicaria approached him as the preparations continued. A word, Dr. Manhattan. He turned his attention to her. She'd removed her helmet, revealing a face marked by burn scars and decades of warfare. Her eyes were gray and hard, the eyes of someone who'd seen too much horror to be shocked anymore. I do not trust you, she stated flatly. I believe you are dangerous, potentially corrupted, and motivated by concerns that do not align with humanity's survival. But I also believe you are competent. So I will give you the same advice I would give any agent entering chaos-corrupted territory. Do not listen to the voices. Do not engage in philosophical debate with demons. Do not believe anything you see or hear. And most importantly, do not try to understand chaos. Understanding is corruption. Ignorance is armor. Manhattan considered her advice. What if understanding is necessary to accomplish my task? Then understand only what you must and forget it immediately after. The warp is information as weapon. Every piece of knowledge you gain about chaos is a hook it can use to pull you deeper. You claim immunity, but immunity is not invincibility. Even you must have limits. Thank you for the warning. She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded curtly and walked away. Manhattan watched her go, noting the slight tremor in her hands that she couldn't quite suppress. A veteran's trauma, probably decades old, triggered by the prospect of opening the Webway gate even briefly. These humans fascinated him. They knew the universe was trying to kill them, knew they served a dying god, knew their efforts were ultimately futile against entropy and chaos. And yet they continued, not from ignorance, but from choice. They had seen the abyss and chosen to spit in its face. It was the most human thing Manhattan had observed in either universe. An hour later, they descended deeper beneath the palace, past the throne room, into caverns that predated human civilization. The walls here were covered in ancient technology, not human, not even recognizably mechanical. This was Eldar work, elegant and alien, designed according to aesthetic principles no human mind could fully grasp. And at the chamber's center, sealed behind layers of psychic barriers that glowed with golden light, was the Webway Gate. The portal itself was enormous, 50 meters tall, carved from a material that existed partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Through the barriers, Manhattan could perceive the tunnel beyond, a corridor of impossible geometry, walls that curved in non-Euclidean angles, filled with swirling warp energy barely contained by failing dimensional membranes. And in that tunnel, demons waited, thousands of them, possibly millions, all held at bay by the Emperor's will alone. I will lower the barriers briefly. The Emperor's thought echoed through the chamber. You will enter. The custodians will accompany you for the first kilometer. Then you continue alone. Understood? Understood. Dr. Manhattan, one final warning. The demons will speak to you in the voice of your past. They will offer you what you most desire. They will show you futures where your choices lead to salvation. All lies. All corruption. Remember who you are. Manhattan almost smiled. I've spent decades uncertain of who I am. That uncertainty may be my greatest defense. Perhaps. We shall see. The golden barriers began to lower, and the Webway gate opened. Hell poured through. The moment the barriers dropped, reality screamed. Manhattan had prepared himself for demonic assault, for warp phenomena, for hostile architecture. What he hadn't anticipated was the sheer sensory overload of unfiltered chaos. The Webway tunnel beyond the gate was saturated with warp energy so dense it had physical weight, pressing against his consciousness like a tidal wave of raw emotion given substance. Rage, despair, ecstasy, transformation. All four chaos gods had claimed portions of the corrupted Webway as their territory, and their presence was absolute. The custodians moved immediately, forming a defensive perimeter around the gate. Their guardian spears blazed with golden fire, not metaphorical fire, but actual flames drawn from the Emperor's own psychic might, channeled through weapons forged specifically for this purpose. The flames created a corridor of relative safety through which Manhattan could advance. Tribune Meridian took point, his armor gleaming even in the twisted light of the Webway. Stay within the flame corridor. The Emperor's fire will protect you from immediate corruption. But once we reach the saturation threshold, you're on your own. Manhattan stepped through the gate. The transition was jarring. In real space, his quantum perception had shown him clean timelines, probability branches that followed logical progressions. In the Webway, causality itself was compromised. He perceived futures that contradicted each other, pasts that changed based on observation, presents that existed in multiple conflicting states simultaneously. The tunnel stretched ahead, or behind, or sideways. Spatial relationships here were suggestions rather than laws. The walls were constructed from psycho-responsive materials that had once maintained dimensional stability through elegant Eldar psychic engineering. Now those walls wept with chaos corruption, the psycho-responsive materials perverted into surfaces that reflected viewers' fears and desires back at them. Manhattan saw himself reflected in the walls, but not as he was, as he'd been. Jonathan Osterman, human, mortal, standing in the observation room before the intrinsic field generator accident, watching himself disintegrate. Feeling the terror of dissolution before consciousness reformed. Ignore the reflections, Meridian commanded. They're not real. They're memories, Manhattan corrected. Accurate ones. The warp is reading my past and manifesting it. Then stop remembering, the custodian replied, or start remembering differently. Belief shapes reality here. If you believe those reflections have power, they will. An interesting observation. Manhattan adjusted his perception, treating the reflections as mere electromagnetic patterns rather than meaningful images. They immediately lost coherence, dissolving into random light and shadow. They advanced deeper. The custodians maintained their formation, weapons ready, psychic wards blazing. But Manhattan could see their strain. Each step into the corrupted webway required them to resist temptations and torments specifically tailored to their psychologies. One custodian was shown visions of the emperor disappointed in his failures. Another saw his fallen brothers, accusing him of surviving when they died. A third was offered godlike power if he'd just lower his spear. They resisted through training, through will, through absolute devotion to their purpose. But Manhattan could perceive their suffering. The warp was testing them, probing for weaknesses, searching for the exact combination of pressure that would break their resolve. After the first kilometer, the custodian stopped. Meridian planted his guardian spear in the ground, creating a focal point of golden flame. This is as far as we can proceed. Beyond this point, the warp saturation exceeds human tolerance. You continue alone. Manhattan examined the tunnel ahead. The corruption intensified dramatically past the custodian's position. The walls no longer merely reflected. They actively reached out, tentacles of semi-solid warp energy grasping toward anything with consciousness. I'll proceed. How will I know when I've reached the breach point? You'll know, Meridian said grimly. Magnus shattered the barriers with enough force to create a wound in reality itself. The breach point is where the webway intersects directly with the deep warp. You'll need to collapse the tunnel on both sides of that intersection to seal it permanently. Understood. Manhattan stepped beyond the protective circle of golden flame. The change was immediate and absolute. Without the Emperor's fire to shield him, the full force of chaos crashed against his consciousness. He'd thought he understood what the warp was, a dimension where emotion had mass and belief shaped reality. But understanding conceptually was different from experiencing directly. The warp was alive, not metaphorically alive like an ecosystem, but genuinely conscious. A malevolent awareness composed of every dark emotion, every twisted desire, every nightmare ever dreamed by thinking beings. And that awareness noticed him instantly. "Hello, little blue god," a voice whispered through the tunnel. Not one of the four chaos gods. Something else. Something older. You think yourself immune? How delightful. Let us test that immunity. The tunnel transformed around him. The walls shifted, the geometry warping, and suddenly Manhattan was standing in Princeton, New Jersey, 1959. The intrinsic field test chamber, exact in every detail down to the molecular level. And standing at the chamber's entrance was Janie Slater, young and beautiful, holding her watch. "John?" Janie's voice was perfect, identical to his memories. "John, I left my watch inside. Could you get it for me?" Manhattan knew this was illusion, warp manifestation drawn from his memories and given temporary form. But the accuracy was remarkable. Janie's expression, her tone, even the way she shifted her weight nervously as she made the request. "You're not real," Manhattan stated. "Does that matter?" Janie asked. "I'm real enough, and I'm offering you something real, the choice you didn't have before. Don't go into the chamber, John. Stay human. Stay with me." Manhattan perceived the trap. This wasn't simple temptation. It was offering him something he'd occasionally wondered about during his decades of godhood. What if he'd refused to enter the chamber? What if he'd stayed human, aged normally, lived an ordinary life with Janie? The choice was made 35 years ago in my timeline. Manhattan replied. I cannot unmake it. But you can, Janie insisted, stepping closer. You manipulate matter. You exist outside normal causality. If you wanted to, you could restructure yourself back into Jonathan Osterman. You could be human again. You could feel again. The offer was seductive not because Manhattan desired humanity, but because it represented the one thing his transformation hadn't granted him, the ability to experience emotions as humans did. He'd lost that capacity along with his mortal flesh. And occasionally, very occasionally, he'd wondered what he'd sacrificed. I don't want to be human again, Manhattan said. Janie's face twisted, her features melting and reforming into something that was almost Janie, but wrong, corrupted. Then what do you want, John? You claim you came here seeking knowledge. I offer you knowledge beyond anything your universe contained. The warp knows everything. Every thought ever conceived, every emotion ever felt, every possibility ever imagined. I can show you secrets that would take 1,000,000 lifetimes to discover through observation alone. And there it was, the real temptation. Not humanity, but understanding. The promise of instant comprehension of phenomena that would otherwise require decades of study. Manhattan examined the offer from every angle. If the warp could genuinely provide that knowledge without corruption, it would be the most efficient path to understanding this universe. But efficiency wasn't the point. The journey of discovery was the purpose, not the destination. Instant knowledge would rob him of the very curiosity that motivated his existence. I decline, Manhattan stated. The Janie thing shrieked, its form exploding into a swarm of smaller demons that rushed toward him with claws and teeth and malevolent hunger. Manhattan dispersed his molecular structure, allowing the demons to pass through empty space, then reconstituted after they'd passed. The demons circled back, reforming into a single massive entity, a greater demon of Tzeentch, covered in eyes and constantly shifting form. The demon spoke with a voice like reality fracturing. You cannot simply ignore us, observer. We are the warp. We are everywhere here. Every thought you think feeds us. Every observation you make gives us form. By merely existing in this space, you sustain us. Manhattan paused. That was actually true. His consciousness, his observations, his very presence in the webway was providing the warp with material to work from. The demons weren't external threats he could fight. They were manifestations spawned by his own active perception. A different approach was required. Manhattan stopped observing in his normal manner. Instead of perceiving the webway as a collection of quantum states to be analyzed, he simply existed. Present but not processing. Aware but not examining. It was the closest thing to meditation he'd experienced since his transformation. The demons flickered, their forms becoming less substantial. Without his active observation feeding them data to work from, they lost coherence. Clever, the greater demon admitted, its form dissipating. But you cannot maintain that state indefinitely. Eventually you must observe to navigate, and when you do, we will be waiting. The demon was right. Manhattan needed to perceive his environment to reach the breach point and accomplish his task. He'd have to find a balance. Enough observation to navigate, not so much that he fed the demons with unlimited material. He proceeded deeper into the webway, maintaining minimal perception. Hours passed, or perhaps seconds. Time was fluid here, stretched and compressed by warp phenomena. The tunnel's corruption intensified with each step. The walls were no longer walls, but living membranes that pulsed with unnatural rhythms. The floor wasn't solid, but rather a surface tension holding back an ocean of chaos below. And then he saw it, the breach point. Magnus the Red had shattered the barriers with such force that reality itself had been torn open. The breach was a wound in space-time, a gaping hole where the webway intersected directly with the deep warp. Through that hole, Manhattan could perceive the raw immaterium, the realm where the chaos gods dwelt in their full power, where mortal concepts like physics or causality had no meaning whatsoever. And standing before the breach, waiting for him, were representatives of all four chaos gods. A bloodthirster of Khorne, 20 meters tall, covered in brass armor and dripping with the blood of countless victims. A lord of change, Tzeentch's greatest demon, its form constantly shifting through impossible configurations. A great unclean one, Nurgle's champion, a mountain of diseased flesh that radiated plague and acceptance, a keeper of secrets, Slaanesh's most perfect demon, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Dr. Manhattan, they spoke in unison, four voices creating a harmony that should have been cacophonous, but was instead hypnotic. Welcome to the heart of the warp. We've been expecting you. Manhattan observed the four greater demons with clinical detachment. Each one was a masterwork of warp manifestation, consciousness given form through the collective belief and emotion of countless souls. The bloodthirster radiated pure martial fury, its existence defined by the desire for combat and bloodshed. The Lord of Change flickered through probability states, simultaneously existing in multiple configurations. The great unclean one exuded a miasma that was equal parts disease and strange contentment. The keeper of secrets embodied sensation refined to its absolute extreme. They were, Manhattan reflected, art pieces created by their respective gods. Horrifying art, but art nonetheless. You block my path, Manhattan stated simply. The Lord of Change laughed, a sound like shattering glass rearranging into musical notes. Block? No, observer. We are here to educate. You seek to close the breach, to deny the warp access to Terra, but you do not understand what you would be destroying. Allow us to illuminate. The demon gestured, and the space around Manhattan transformed. He was suddenly perceiving the webway from a different vantage, not as a physical structure, but as a conceptual framework. The webway was a membrane between order and chaos, between the materium and immaterium. Closing it wouldn't simply seal a tunnel, it would sever a connection point where the two fundamental forces of reality intersected. You see, the Lord of Change continued, the warp and real space are not enemies. They are complementary aspects of existence. Emotion and thought, given substance in the warp, return to inspire and motivate material beings. Material beings experience reality and generate the emotions that sustain the warp. It is a cycle. You would break that cycle. The cycle is predatory, Manhattan countered. The warp feeds on consciousness, corrupts it, and returns it as demon and madness. That's not complementary. That's parasitic. The great unclean one rumbled forward, each step leaving footprints of decay. Parasitic? How judgmental, little blue one. Is it parasitic when bacteria break down a corpse and return its nutrients to the soil? Is it parasitic when predators cull the weak from prey populations? We are part of the natural order, entropy and change, suffering and growth. You would sanitize reality, make it clean and lifeless. But life requires death. Growth requires decay. Progress requires destruction. Manhattan examined the philosophical argument and found it technically accurate but morally repugnant. Yes, entropy was natural. Yes, predation served ecological functions. But the chaos gods weren't natural selection. They were exploitation refined to an absolute. They didn't call the weak. They corrupted the strong and devoured everyone. I'm not here to debate ecology, Manhattan said. I'm here to close the breach. The bloodthirster stepped forward, its massive axe crackling with warp energy. Then you go through me, observer. I am Khorne's will made manifest. I have slaughtered space marines by the dozen, torn apart titans with my bare hands, reduced entire armies to corpses. You think your quantum tricks will save you? I don't need saving, Manhattan replied. You're not physically present. You're a warp manifestation given temporary form by the breach. I can perceive your actual structure, your compressed emotion bound together by belief and psychic energy. You have no atoms, no molecules, no physical substance for me to manipulate. Exactly, the bloodthirster growled. Which means your powers are useless against me. You cannot destroy what has no material form, but I can destroy you, because here in the warp, belief shapes reality, and I believe I can tear you apart. The demon attacked with speed that defied its massive size. The axe descended toward Manhattan's skull, crackling with energy designed to sever the connection between soul and body. Manhattan dispersed his molecular structure, allowing the blade to pass through empty space. The bloodthirster roared in frustration and swung again, and again. Each time Manhattan simply wasn't there. existing in states of dispersed probability that the demon's weapon couldn't interact with. You cannot fight what you cannot touch, Manhattan observed, and you cannot touch me because we exist in fundamentally incompatible states. You are warp entity. I am matter entity. The breach allows us to coexist in the same space, but not to directly interact. Then we shall make you compatible, the Keeper of Secrets purred, its voice containing harmonics that triggered responses in Manhattan's consciousness he didn't possess. The demon was attempting to generate emotional reactions, desire, fear, anger, that would make Manhattan vulnerable to warp manipulation. But Manhattan's consciousness operated on different principles. He didn't have emotions in the conventional sense. He had preferences based on logical evaluation, curiosity about unexplored phenomena, and something approximating aesthetic appreciation. But these weren't emotions the demons could exploit because they lacked the neurochemical and psychological foundations that made human emotions manipulable. I am not compatible, Manhattan stated. I will never be compatible. You are wasting your time. The four greater demons exchanged glances, a gesture that seemed strangely human for beings of pure warp energy. Then the Lord of Change spoke again, its voice taking on a different quality, resignation mixed with respect. You are correct. You are genuinely immune, not through strength or faith, but through incompatibility. We cannot corrupt what we cannot understand, and your quantum nature is fundamentally alien to our existence. Zinch foresaw this possibility. He finds it amusing. Then stand aside, Manhattan said. Allow me to close the breach. No, all four demons responded simultaneously. The bloodthirster continued. You may be immune to our corruption, but you are not immune to physical obstruction. We cannot harm you directly, but we can prevent you from reaching the breach mechanism. We can delay you indefinitely, and delay is sufficient. Every moment the breach remains open, more warp energy floods into the webway. Eventually, the corruption will spread to Terra itself. The Emperor knows this. It is why he maintains the seal at such terrible cost. Manhattan calculated possibilities. The demons were correct. They could obstruct him without directly engaging. They could create barriers of warp energy he'd have to navigate around. They could summon endless lesser demons to swarm his position. They could make reaching the breach's closure mechanism take weeks or months, during which time the Emperor would be forced to maintain his seal without assistance, unless Manhattan found a different approach. You said you cannot corrupt me because you cannot understand me, Manhattan observed, but understanding works both ways. I cannot fully understand you because my consciousness operates on principles incompatible with yours. However, I can observe, I can analyze, and I can learn. The Lord of Change's eyes, all 17 of them, focused on Manhattan with sudden intense interest. What are you proposing? An exchange. I will allow you to study my quantum nature if you allow me to study yours. We both gain knowledge. We both achieve our goals. Our goal is to keep the breach open, the Great Unclean One pointed out, almost apologetically. Your goal is to close it. These objectives are mutually exclusive. Are they? Manhattan asked. You want to understand how a being can exist outside the warp's influence? I want to understand how warp entities function. The breach is merely a tactical position in a strategic conflict, but knowledge, understanding, that's valuable independent of any specific battle. The Keeper of Secrets smiled, an expression both beautiful and terrible. You would trade knowledge of your quantum immunity for knowledge of our demonic nature? And you believe this somehow helps you close the breach? I believe that if I understand how you maintain coherence in real space, I can disrupt that coherence. Not through force, but through precision. I can find the exact configuration of probability states that would cause your manifestation to collapse without requiring direct combat. The four demons fell silent. Manhattan could almost perceive them communicating with their respective gods, seeking guidance on this unprecedented situation. Finally, the Lord of Change spoke. Zinch agrees to your proposal. Change through knowledge serves his purposes, but he adds a condition. If through understanding our nature, you discover that chaos serves a necessary function in reality's ecosystem, you must abandon your mission and allow the breach to remain open. And if I discover that chaos is purely destructive with no redeeming function, then we step aside and allow you to close the breach. Tzeentch values truth over victory. He finds the pursuit of knowledge more important than the outcome of this single battle. Manhattan examined the offer from every angle, searching for hidden traps or deceptive phrasing. The Chaos Gods were legendary for their treachery, but this offer seemed genuine, probably because Tzeentch genuinely was curious about what Manhattan would conclude after studying demonic nature. The Chaos God was gambling that understanding would lead to acceptance, or at least to acknowledgement of Chaos's role in reality. It was a gamble Manhattan was willing to take. Agreed, Manhattan said. The Lord of Change extended a wing, and reality folded around Manhattan. He was suddenly perceiving the demon's internal structure, not physical structure, but the patterns of belief and emotion that held its consciousness together. The demon was composed of thousands of individual thoughts about change, transformation, and ambition, all harvested from mortal minds and woven together into a coherent entity. Each thought was a thread, and the demon was a tapestry, but the threads were fraying. Maintaining coherent form in real space required constant effort, constant reinforcement from the warp. Without that connection, the demon would unravel back into its component thoughts. Simultaneously, Manhattan felt his own quantum nature being examined. The demons were perceiving him across multiple dimensions, analyzing how his consciousness maintained control over his atomic structure, how his observation collapsed quantum possibilities into fixed states. They were learning from him, even as he learned from them. Hours passed in what felt like seconds. Manhattan studied demon after demon, greater and lesser, all four varieties, examining their structures and comparing them to his own. And slowly a picture emerged. Demons were belief given form, but belief required believers. In the deep warp, where countless mortal souls generated endless emotion, demons had unlimited sustenance. But here in the webway, a space designed to exclude the warp, demons could only maintain form through the breach itself. The breach was their anchor point, the connection that allowed them to exist in this liminal space between real space and the warp. If he severed that connection, the demons wouldn't be destroyed. They'd simply return to the deep warp, their manifestations collapsing without the breach to sustain them. You understand now, the Lord of Change observed. Close the breach, and we return to the realm of pure chaos. We lose this foothold in real space. Yes, Manhattan confirmed, but you lose nothing essential. You continue to exist. You simply exist elsewhere. And in your analysis, the demon pressed, did you discover that chaos serves a necessary function? Or are we purely destructive? Manhattan considered his findings carefully. The chaos gods fed on emotion. That was undeniable. They corrupted mortals. Also undeniable. They caused suffering on scales almost incomprehensible. But they also provided certain services. Khorne offered strength to those who would otherwise die helpless. Tzeentch granted knowledge to those trapped in ignorance. Nurgle provided acceptance to those facing unbearable pain. Slaanesh offered intensity to lives otherwise wasted in monotony. The services came with terrible prices, but they existed nonetheless. Chaos serves functions that mortals have created a need for, Manhattan concluded. You exist because sentient beings desire strength, knowledge, acceptance, and experience. If those beings achieve those goals through non-corruptive means, chaos would weaken. You're not necessary to reality. You're an opportunistic infection exploiting vulnerabilities in consciousness. But you're correct that eliminating you would require eliminating the conditions that created you. The Lord of Change regarded Manhattan with something approaching respect. An honest assessment, and one that acknowledges we cannot be destroyed, only managed. Will you still close the breach, knowing we'll simply find another path to Terra eventually? Yes, because closing this breach removes an immediate threat and forces you to expend resources finding new pathways. That's not victory, but it's progress. And in a universe where final victory appears impossible, progress is sufficient. The demon laughed. Genuine amusement this time. You think like a god and act like a mortal. Tzeentch truly does find you fascinating. Very well, observer. We honor our agreement. The breach is yours to close. The four greater demons stepped aside, clearing a path to the breach itself. Manhattan approached the wound in reality, examining its structure carefully. The breach was a tear where dimensional barriers had been shattered, allowing the deep warp to bleed directly into the webway. Closing it would require rebuilding those barriers at the quantum level, essentially stitching reality back together. It would take everything he had. Manhattan placed his hands on either side of the breach and began to work. The breach was agony made spatial. Manhattan had restructured matter countless times, built bridges from sand, turned bullets into flowers, rearranged molecules with the casual ease of breathing. But this was different. The breach wasn't just damaged matter. It was a wound in the fundamental fabric of reality, where the laws of physics had been replaced by the screaming chaos of pure emotion. He extended his consciousness into the breach, perceiving its structure across multiple dimensions. The Eldar had built the webway using psycho-reactive materials held in precise dimensional alignment through elegant psychic architecture. Magnus's psychic scream had shattered that alignment, breaking the barriers that kept the warp at bay. Now the deep warp pressed against the wound from one side, and real space tried to collapse inward from the other, creating a dimensional pressure differential that Manhattan could actually feel despite having no conventional nervous system. He began by stabilizing the edges. The dimensional barriers were frayed, threads of reality unraveling into quantum uncertainty. Manhattan traced each thread back to its origin point and began reconstructing the crystalline matrices that the Eldar had used to anchor the barriers in place. His consciousness divided across thousands of parallel processes, each one handling a different aspect of the reconstruction. The warp fought him, not consciously. The four greater demons had honored their bargain and stepped aside, but the warp itself, the fundamental nature of the immaterium, resisted being excluded. It pressed against every barrier Manhattan erected, seeking weaknesses, finding microscopic gaps and forcing them wider. Manhattan had to work faster than the warp could exploit his repairs, essentially racing entropy itself. Hours passed, or days. Time had lost all conventional meaning in the webway. Manhattan's consciousness was fully engaged in the reconstruction, operating at speeds that would have made his thoughts incomprehensible to any observer. He perceived individual atoms, positioned them precisely, bonded them with electromagnetic force, and moved on to the next atom before the previous bond could fail. The work was exhausting in ways he'd never experienced. In his original universe, Manhattan had effectively infinite energy. He could convert matter to energy whenever he needed more. But here, the warp was actively interfering with those conversions, introducing inefficiencies that should have been impossible. He was burning through energy reserves faster than he could replenish them. And then he perceived something that made him pause. The dimensional barriers he was rebuilding weren't just physical structures. They were psychically charged, designed to resonate with Eldar consciousness patterns. The Eldar had built the webway to respond to their thoughts, to reshape itself according to their psychic will. Without that psychic component, the barriers would be mere matter, vulnerable to future psychic assault. Manhattan couldn't replicate Eldar psychic patterns, but he could observe the Emperor's psychic seal from a distance and analyze its structure. The Emperor had been holding the breach closed through sheer force of will, projecting his consciousness across the wound and manually preventing demons from entering. It was brutally inefficient, the psychic equivalent of holding a dam closed with your bare hands. But Manhattan could make it efficient. He began incorporating elements of the Emperor's psychic signature into the barriers he was building, not copying the Emperor's consciousness, that would be impossible, but creating resonance patterns that would amplify the Emperor's existing seal. Each barrier he erected became a force multiplier, allowing the Emperor's psychic might to spread more effectively across the breach. From Terra, Manhattan perceived a shift in the Emperor's attention. A moment of surprise, barely a flicker in the vast consciousness of monitoring a million worlds, as he realized what Manhattan was doing. Clever, the Emperor's thought echoed across the distance. You make my seal permanent. I will no longer need to maintain it actively. That was the intention, Manhattan replied, his voice vibrating through quantum fluctuations in the webway structure. You can redirect that attention elsewhere. Already done. 3 ships in the Segmentum Obscurus just regained astronomical guidance. 17 prayers in the hive worlds of Ultima Segmentum just received answers. 43 demon incursions across the Imperium just encountered increased resistance. Your work matters, Dr. Manhattan. The acknowledgement gave Manhattan something he hadn't experienced in decades. Satisfaction. Not pride. Pride required ego he no longer possessed, but satisfaction in solving a complex problem and achieving a measurable result. He'd forgotten how that felt. The work continued. Manhattan built barrier after barrier, each one anchored to the previous, creating an overlapping network of dimensional stability. The breach began to shrink, the wound in reality slowly stitching closed as the deep warp was forced back into its proper realm. The four greater demons watched from their positions, maintaining their promise not to interfere. But Manhattan could perceive their discomfort as the breach narrowed. They were losing their anchor point, their connection to real space failing as he rebuilt the barriers. You honor your agreement, Manhattan observed while continuing his work. Sinch honors knowledge gained, the Lord of Change replied. We learned much from studying you. That knowledge is more valuable than this single breach. There will be others. But you, Dr. Manhattan, there is only one of you. The knowledge of how to resist warp corruption through quantum incompatibility? That is priceless. You'll attempt to use that knowledge to corrupt other beings, Manhattan stated. Of course, the demon agreed without shame. Understanding how you resist allows us to identify who cannot resist using the same mechanisms. It's simple logic, but that doesn't diminish the value of the exchange. We both gained what we sought. Manhattan couldn't argue with that assessment. The demon was correct. Knowledge had been exchanged fairly, and both parties would use that knowledge according to their natures. Whether that was moral was a question Manhattan had stopped trying to answer. The breach was nearly closed now. Only a few meters remained, and Manhattan was constructing the final barriers with meticulous precision. These last barriers would need to be strongest. The warp would concentrate all its pressure on the weakest points. And then something unexpected happened. A fifth presence entered the webway, manifesting between Manhattan and the closing breach. This wasn't a demon or a chaos god. This was something else entirely. A figure in ornate armor the color of deep crimson, covered in arcane symbols that hurt to perceive. A single eye blazed on the figure's chest, radiating psychic power that rivaled even the greater demons. Magnus the Red, the demon Primarch, the one who'd shattered the barriers in the first place. So, Magnus's voice resonated through the webway, cultured and bitter. Someone is finally undoing my greatest mistake. How appropriate. Manhattan examined the Primarch carefully. Magnus had once been human, one of the Emperor's genetically engineered sons, designed to be humanity's champion. But he'd been corrupted by Sinch, transformed into a demon prince, his body rebuilt from warp energy, and his soul bound to the changer of ways. He was simultaneously mortal and demon, human and monster, and he was not attacking. You're not trying to stop me, Manhattan observed. Magnus laughed, a sound that carried layers of pain beneath the mockery. Why would I? I broke these barriers trying to warn my father about Horus's betrayal. I thought I was saving the Imperium. Instead, I damned it, and myself. For 10,000 years, I've watched demons pour through the hole I created. For 10,000 years, I've known my father spends every moment holding closed the wound I inflicted. Do you think I want that to continue? Then why appear now? To witness the closure, to see my mistake finally corrected. Magnus paused, his single eye focusing on Manhattan with uncomfortable intensity. And to warn you, you've made a bargain with the four greater demons. You've studied demonic nature. You've touched the warp directly and emerged uncorrupted. That makes you unique and uniquely interesting to the ruinous powers. They will not leave you alone simply because you closed one breach. I expected as much. Did you expect this? Magnus gestured, and the space around Manhattan shifted. He was suddenly perceiving himself from the demon's perspective, and what he saw troubled him. His quantum signature had changed, not corrupted exactly, but altered. By studying demonic nature, by touching the warp directly, by existing in this space for so long, he'd absorbed trace elements of warp energy, not enough to corrupt him, but enough to make him more visible, more substantial to entities that operated in the immaterium. You're marked now, Magnus explained, not corrupted, not tainted, but marked. The Chaos Gods will always be able to find you. Across universes, across dimensions, you've made yourself known to them. That was Tzeentch's real goal. Not keeping the breach open, but making sure you couldn't simply disappear back into the quantum foam when this task was complete. Manhattan processed this revelation. The mark wasn't harmful. It didn't affect his capabilities or his consciousness, but it was permanent. He'd traded anonymity for knowledge, and he couldn't undo that trade. A calculated risk, Manhattan concluded. I gained understanding of how this universe functions. The cost is ongoing interest from entities I was already aware of. You're remarkably calm about being marked by chaos, Magnus observed. Being upset would be irrational. The choice was made. The consequences are acceptable. Emotional response won't change the outcome. Magnus studied Manhattan for a long moment. You really are immune to corruption, aren't you? Not through faith or strength, but through sheer incompatibility. My father chose his agent well. I'm not his agent. I'm an independent actor pursuing my own objectives. Of course, Magnus replied, with a tone that suggested he didn't believe that at all. Well, independent actor, you should finish your work. The breach won't close itself. Manhattan returned his attention to the final barriers. Only meters remained now. He could perceive the Emperor's psychic seal strengthening as the breach narrowed, the burden on the master of mankind decreasing with each barrier Manhattan erected. He built the final barrier with particular care, making it seamless with the surrounding webway structure. The barrier clicked into place, and the breach closed. For the first time in 10,000 years, the wound in reality sealed completely. The effect was immediate. The four greater demons began to fade, their manifestations losing coherence as their anchor to real space failed. They didn't fight it. They'd made their bargain and honored it. The Lord of Change offered a final nod of acknowledgement before dissolving back into pure warp energy. Magnus watched them disappear, his expression unreadable. 10,000 years, he repeated quietly. 10,000 years of holding close what I broke in a moment of arrogance. You've given my father back something I stole from him, the ability to direct his full attention elsewhere. It was necessary, Manhattan said simply. Necessary, Magnus echoed. Yes, I suppose it was. He turned to leave, his form beginning to fade back into the warp. But before he vanished completely, he offered one final statement. Be careful, observer. You've solved one of the Imperium's greatest problems. That makes you valuable. And in the 41st millennium, being valuable is often more dangerous than being threatened. Then he was gone, and Manhattan was alone in the webway. The tunnel was still corrupted. Decades or centuries would be required to purge the chaos taint from its structure. But the breach was closed. The deep warp could no longer pour directly into Terra's foundations. The mission was complete. Manhattan began the long walk back toward the gate, toward the custodians waiting at the safe perimeter. His energy reserves were depleted to levels he'd never experienced before. He was exhausted in ways that transcended physical fatigue. His consciousness itself felt strained, stretched thin by hours of operating at absolute capacity while fighting the warp's interference. But he'd succeeded, and he'd learned more about this universe in those hours than he'd learned in all his previous observations combined. The warp was chaos, yes, but it was structured chaos, operating on principles that were alien but not random. Demons were predatory, but they followed their own logic. The Emperor was dying, but also transforming into something that might transcend death entirely. This universe was comprehensible, difficult, dangerous, and utterly unforgiving, but comprehensible. And that meant Manhattan could continue his observations, continue learning, continue existing in this new reality he'd chosen to explore. When he finally reached the custodian's position, Tribune Meridian stood ready with his guardian spear blazing. The weapon lowered slightly when he confirmed Manhattan's approach. Is it done? Meridian asked. It's done. The breach is closed. The Emperor no longer needs to maintain the seal. The custodian's stance shifted. Not quite relaxation, but something close. Relief, perhaps. Then you have honored your agreement, and we will honor ours. You will have greater freedom within the Imperium, as the Emperor promised. Manhattan nodded and prepared to return to Terra. He'd closed the breach. But Magnus's warning echoed in his consciousness. Being valuable was dangerous. He'd solved one problem for the Imperium, and in doing so, he'd made himself important to beings who measured value in terms of utility. The real test, Manhattan suspected, was just beginning. The return to Terra was triumphant in the way that military victories in the Imperium were always triumphant. Solemn, heavily documented, and immediately analyzed for strategic implications. Manhattan emerged from the Webway Gate to find the throne room filled with representatives from every major Imperial organization, all waiting to assess whether the extra-universal entity had succeeded or been corrupted. The Emperor's psychic presence confirmed success before Manhattan could speak. The breach is sealed. The burden is lifted. Dr. Manhattan has fulfilled his agreement. The chamber erupted not in celebration, but in organized efficiency. Tech priests immediately began scanning Manhattan for chaos taint, their Auspex devices sweeping across his molecular structure. Inquisitors activated psychic detection equipment, searching for demonic possession or corruption markers. Custodians maintained defensive positions, guardian spears ready in case the test revealed contamination. Inquisitor Vicaria approached with a device that resembled a mechanical eye mounted on a staff. This is a Lux Veritas. It detects the psychic signatures of chaos exposure. Hold still. Manhattan complied as the device swept across his form. It emitted a low hum that slowly increased in pitch, then settled into what sounded like confusion. Mechanical uncertainty translated into audio feedback. Anomalous readings, Vicaria announced to the assembled observers. He shows evidence of warp exposure, extensive exposure, consistent with hours spent in high-saturation environments, but no corruption markers, no demonic taint, no possession indicators. He's been marked by the warp but not corrupted by it. I've never seen anything like this. Explain the mark, Captain General Valoris demanded, his tone carrying the weight of command. What does it mean that the warp has marked you? Manhattan considered how to explain quantum-level changes in his signature that made him more perceptible to warp entities. The warp operates partially through observation and belief. By existing in that environment and interacting with its inhabitants, I became more real to warp entities. They can now perceive me more easily across dimensional boundaries. It's similar to having gained a reputation. Entities that operate through the warp will remember me and recognize me if we interact again. That sounds like a vector for corruption, an ecclesiarchy priest interjected nervously. If the ruinous powers can always find you, they could always find me, Manhattan corrected. I exist. Existence itself makes one findable to sufficiently motivated observers. The mark simply makes finding me require less effort on their part. But finding me is not the same as corrupting me. Our previous analysis stands. My consciousness operates on principles incompatible with warp-based corruption. Magos Theta 97 practically vibrated forward, his mechadendrites extended pleadingly. You interacted directly with greater demons for extended periods and emerged with knowledge of their internal structure? You must share this data. The Omnissiah's quest for knowledge demands. Magos, Tribune Meridian interrupted coldly. Dr. Manhattan will be debriefed through proper channels. Your enthusiasm is noted and will be appropriately redirected. The tech priest deflated slightly but continued recording every word with his augmetic systems. The Emperor's presence intensified, his attention focusing more fully on the throne room than Manhattan had yet witnessed. The cost was immediate and visible. Across Terra, billions of prayers went momentarily unanswered as the master of mankind withdrew attention from his galaxy-spanning duties to address this moment directly. Dr. Manhattan, you have completed your task and demonstrated your resistance to chaos corruption through extended exposure. You have earned greater freedom within the Imperium. But before that freedom is granted, I must ask, what did you learn in the Webway? What knowledge did you trade with the demons? Manhattan had expected this question. I traded understanding of my quantum immunity for understanding of demonic structural composition. I learned that demons are belief and emotion given coherent form, sustained by connection to the deep warp. I learned that they can be dispersed not through violence, but through severing their anchor points to real space. And I learned that chaos serves functions created by sentient beings' needs. It is opportunistic, not necessary. Eliminating chaos would require addressing the conditions that create demand for what it offers. In your assessment of chaos's role in reality, parasitic, exploitative, dangerous, but not externally imposed. Chaos exists because sentient beings generate the emotions it feeds upon. You cannot destroy it without destroying consciousness itself. You can only manage it, resist it, and minimize the conditions that allow it to flourish. The Emperor's presence carried something that might have been approval. That assessment aligns with 10,000 years of my own observations. You have proven yourself capable of direct warp exposure without losing objectivity. That is rarer than you might imagine. Most who study chaos closely eventually justify its existence. You studied it and concluded it remains a threat to be managed. Because that's what the evidence supports, Manhattan replied simply. Precisely. Captain General Valoris, Dr. Manhattan is to be granted Level 7 clearance for travel throughout the Imperium. He may observe, study, and interact with Imperial citizens and organizations without constant military escort. However, he remains restricted from classified military installations, forge worlds without explicit Mechanicus permission, and any location within the Eye of Terror or other warp-saturated regions without my direct authorization. Valoris saluted crisply. It will be done, my lord. Dr. Manhattan, use your freedom wisely. Observe what you wish, learn what you can, but understand that your presence will have consequences. You are now known to the ruinous powers, to the major factions of the Imperium, and to every intelligence network that monitors unusual phenomena. Anonymity is no longer an option for you. Accept that reality and act accordingly. I understand. Then go. There is a galaxy to observe. The Emperor's attention withdrew, spreading back across his duties with almost audible relief, like a man who'd been holding his breath, finally allowed to exhale. The assembled representatives began dispersing, returning to their various organizations with reports to file and protocols to update. Manhattan found himself standing alone in the throne room except for Tribune Meridian, who remained at his position near the throne. What will you do now? The custodian asked. Manhattan considered the question. He'd completed his immediate task. He'd gained the freedom to explore the Imperium without constant supervision. The galaxy was open to him. A million worlds, countless phenomena, infinite variations on the theme of human survival in hostile circumstances. I will observe, Manhattan decided. I've seen Terra, Mars, and Cadia. I've interacted with the Imperium's leadership and military, but I haven't seen normal human life in this universe. I haven't observed how ordinary citizens exist in the 41st millennium. That seems like the logical next step. Meridian's expression shifted fractionally, something that might have been approval. You could visit the hive worlds, where billions live in vertical cities that scrape the sky, or the agri-worlds, where entire planets are devoted to feeding the Imperium. Or the shrine worlds, where pilgrims travel to honor the Emperor's greatest saints. Or the frontier worlds on the edges of Imperial space, where colonists struggle against Xenos threats in isolation. Which would you recommend? The custodian considered. If you want to understand ordinary human life in the Imperium, visit a hive world. Specifically, visit Necromunda. It's a hive world in the Segmentum Solar, relatively close to Terra. The hives there contain every stratum of Imperial society, from noble houses in the spires to gangers in the underhive. You'll see the Imperium's social structure in microcosm, the wealthy few at the top, the struggling majority in the middle, and the desperate masses at the bottom. And you believe this will be illuminating. I believe it will be honest. Necromunda doesn't pretend to be perfect. It's a world where humanity's virtues and vices are on full display without the political theater you'd encounter in more civilized sectors. If you want to understand what the Imperium really is beneath its grand rhetoric, that's where you should look. Manhattan nodded. Then that's where I'll go. How do I arrange transport? You don't need transport. You can teleport, can't you? Yes, but I need coordinates and an understanding of local space to avoid materializing inside solid matter. Meridian produced a data slate from his armor's storage compartment. Necromunda's coordinates. The hive city of Hive Primus is the largest settlement. Materialize outside the hive and enter through normal channels, your appearance will attract enough attention without adding miraculous materialization to the spectacle. Manhattan accepted the data slate and reviewed the coordinates. Necromunda was 17 light-years from Terra, a trivial distance for teleportation. He could be there in moments. "Thank you for the recommendation," Manhattan said. "Don't thank me yet," Meridian replied. "Necromunda is violent, corrupt, and dangerous even by Imperial standards. Your immunity to chaos won't protect you from a stub gun to the back of the head or a knife between the ribs. Stay alert. Trust no one. And remember, in the Underhive, power is the only language anyone speaks." "I'll remember." Manhattan prepared to teleport, but Meridian stopped him with a raised hand. "One more thing. You closed the webway breach. You gave the Emperor back a portion of his attention. That matters more than you might realize. Ships that would have been lost in the warp will find their way home. Prayers that would have gone unanswered will receive his attention. Demon incursions that would have succeeded will face greater resistance. You saved lives, millions of them, possibly billions over the centuries. I don't know if that matters to you, but it matters to us." Manhattan considered the statement. Did it matter to him? He'd performed the task because he'd agreed to it and because it represented an interesting technical challenge. The lives saved were a byproduct, not the goal. But examining his motivations more closely, he found something unexpected. Satisfaction. Not pride in the conventional sense, but satisfaction in having performed a task that achieved measurable, positive results. "It matters," Manhattan admitted. "Perhaps not in the way you'd prefer, but it matters." Meridian nodded. "That's more human than you realize. Now go. Necromunda awaits, and the Imperium won't pause for your philosophical contemplations." Manhattan teleported. The transition was instantaneous. One moment standing in Terra's throne room, the next floating in the void 17 light-years distant. Below him, Necromunda rotated slowly, a diseased sphere of gray and brown where green should have been. The planet's surface was covered entirely in hive cities, massive vertical metropolises that rose kilometers into the polluted sky. Hive Primus dominated the largest continent, a mountain of architecture and industry that housed billions. Manhattan descended toward the hive's exterior, choosing a landing point in one of the mid-level districts where his arrival would be noticed but not immediately trigger military response. He restructured his appearance slightly, not changing his blue coloration or atomic structure, but manifesting clothing that wouldn't mark him as completely alien. The blue robes the Mechanicus had provided served well enough, though he simplified them to reduce ornamentation. He materialized in an alley between two hab blocks, structures that were simultaneously homes, factories, and fortresses. The air was thick with industrial pollutants, and the ambient noise was overwhelming. Millions of humans living, working, fighting, and dying in close proximity generated a cacophony that never ceased. Manhattan stepped into the street and was immediately confronted by a reality vastly different from Terra's political theater or Mars's technological monasteries. This was humanity raw, desperate, violent, and struggling to survive one day at a time. A woman dragged a cart of recycled materials past him, her augmetic arm sparking as it malfunctioned. A gang of youths eyed him from a doorway, calculating whether he was prey or predator. Somewhere nearby, gunshots echoed through the hive's metal corridors. An ecclesiarchy preacher stood on a corner, screaming about salvation and damnation to citizens who mostly ignored him. And above it all, barely visible through the layers of smog and architecture, the hive's spire rose toward the sky, home to the noble houses who ruled this world from climate-controlled luxury, while the masses below them fought over scraps. Manhattan had asked what ordinary human life looked like in the 41st millennium. Now he would observe the answer. Necromunda assaulted Manhattan's senses with intensity he hadn't anticipated. Terra had been grand, architecture and ceremony designed to inspire awe. Mars had been technical, forged temples where technology and theology merged, but Necromunda was visceral. Every surface was covered in grime, accumulated over millennia. The air tasted of chemicals and desperation, and the humans, billions of them packed into vertical space, generated a psychic pressure that even Manhattan could detect, a collective scream of need that never quite reached conscious expression. He walked through the mid-hive districts observing. Workers emerged from 12-hour shifts in manufactorums, their faces gray with exhaustion and toxic exposure. Children played in the streets, their games involving mock gang warfare and improvised weapons. Vendors sold reclaimed food, corpse starch processed from the dead, marketed with labels that promised nutrition, if not palatability. A man approached Manhattan with the confident stride of someone accustomed to confrontation. He wore the colors of House Goliath, one of the Hive's major gang families, and his arms were augmented with crude bionics that added mass but little sophistication. "You're new," the man stated, positioning himself to block Manhattan's path. "New means you don't know the rules. Lucky for you, I'm feeling educational today. This district pays tribute to Goliath. You want to pass through, you pay the toll. 5 credits. Manhattan examined the man's physiology. Enhanced musculature, subdermal armor plating, combat stimulant dispensers implanted along the spine. The augmentations were brutal but effective. This human had been modified to be a weapon, sacrificing longevity for immediate combat effectiveness. "I don't have credits," Manhattan replied honestly. The man's expression darkened. "Then you've got a problem. We don't accept excuses. Pay or we take payment in blood." 3 more Goliath gangers emerged from nearby doorways, each one similarly augmented. They carried weapons that ranged from crude stub guns to more sophisticated plasma pistols. All 4 had positioned themselves to create a kill box. Manhattan was surrounded, and any attempt to flee would put him in multiple firing lines simultaneously. It was tactically competent. Against a normal human, it would have been lethal. "I would prefer not to engage in violence," Manhattan said. The lead ganger laughed. "You don't get to prefer blue skin. You pay, you bleed, or you run and then bleed. Those are your options." Manhattan calculated responses. He could teleport away. Simple, efficient, but it would create questions about what he was and potentially trigger wider conflict. He could disperse his molecular structure and allow their attacks to pass through him, more impressive, but similarly mysterious. Or he could demonstrate capability in a way that discouraged further confrontation without causing permanent harm. He chose the third option. Manhattan reached out and restructured the molecular bonds in the lead ganger's stub gun. The weapon didn't explode or melt. It simply ceased being a weapon. The metal flowed like liquid, reforming into an intricate sculpture of a bird taking flight. The transformation took less than a second. The ganger stared at his hand, now holding art instead of armament. His companions raised their own weapons, but Manhattan was faster. He restructured their guns simultaneously. One became a flower, delicate petals of metal impossibly thin. Another became a geometric puzzle, interlocking pieces that couldn't possibly fit together but did. The third became a small clock, ticking with mechanical precision despite having no conventional components. "I prefer not to engage in violence," Manhattan repeated, "but I am capable of it. I would rather we part peacefully." The lead ganger examined the metal bird in his hand, his augmented muscles tensing and relaxing as his combat stimulants flooded his system with conflicting signals. Fight or flee? The enemy was clearly more dangerous than anticipated, but gang pride demanded response to challenges. A new voice interrupted the standoff. "Stand down, Crag. That one's not your prey." An older woman emerged from the shadows, her face a map of scars and her eyes augmented with sophisticated optical implants that glowed with targeting data. She wore no gang colors, but the Goliath gangers immediately deferred to her presence. Matriarch Saris, the lead ganger, Crag, acknowledged with something approaching respect. "This blue skin just... I saw what he did. Molecular restructuring without tools, without delay, without effort. That's not tech we've seen before." She turned her optical array on Manhattan, scanning across multiple spectrums. "And his biology reads as human, but modified beyond anything in House Goliath's augmentation protocols. You're not from Necromunda, are you?" "No," Manhattan confirmed. "I'm visiting, observing." "Observing what?" "How humans live in this era. I've seen the Imperium's leadership, its military, its religious and technical hierarchies. Now I want to see how ordinary citizens exist." Saris laughed, a harsh sound that carried no humor. "Ordinary citizens? You came to Necromunda to see ordinary citizens? This is one of the worst hive worlds in the sector. If you want to see ordinary, you should visit an agri-world or a civilized sector capital. I was told Necromunda would show me humanity without pretense. Ah, Saris's optical implants cycled through different filtering modes as she continued assessing Manhattan. Someone sent you here specifically. Let me guess. Terra? One of the Golden Boys suggested you visit the underbelly of the Imperium to see what the Emperor's grand vision looks like when stripped of propaganda? A custodian recommended this location. Of course he did. They're honest, I'll give them that much. Brutal and fanatically loyal, but honest. She gestured for the Goliath gangers to disperse. They retreated but maintained surveillance positions. Clearly this wasn't over, just postponed. Come with me, Blue Skin. If you're here to observe, I'll show you what you came to see. But it's going to cost you. I told your ganger, I don't have credits. Not money, knowledge. You restructured matter with a thought. I've never seen tech that sophisticated, not even in the spires where the noble houses keep their most advanced augmetics. Teach me how you did it, and I'll show you the real Necromunda. The parts tourists and administratum inspectors never see. Manhattan considered the proposal. Sharing knowledge of quantum manipulation with a gang matriarch could have unpredictable consequences. But observation required access, and this woman was offering exactly that. I can't teach you what I did, Manhattan replied. My capabilities are the result of a unique transformation that changed my fundamental relationship with matter. But I can explain the principles involved and perhaps suggest technological approaches that would achieve similar results. Saris's optical implants brightened with interest. Good enough. Follow me, and try not to restructure anything else unless I specifically ask. You're attracting enough attention already. She led him deeper into the hive, through corridors that descended in irregular staircases and ramps. The architecture became more chaotic the lower they went. Different eras of construction layered on top of each other, creating a vertical archaeological record of the hive's history. The crowds thinned as they descended. The mid-hive's desperate masses gave way to the underhive's dangerous few. You picked an interesting time to visit, Saris commented as they walked. There's a gang war brewing between houses Escher and Orlok over control of a newly discovered archaeotech cache. Both sides are hiring mercenaries, which means everyone's armed and paranoid. Add in the usual cult activity, mutant uprisings, and occasional Genestealer infestation, and you've got Necromunda at its most chaotic. Genestealer? Manhattan queried. Xenos bioforms, Tyranid vanguard organisms. They infect humans with genetic material that transforms their children into hybrid creatures, loyal to the hive fleet. We purge them when we find them, but they're persistent. Like roaches, kill one nest and 3 more pop up elsewhere. Manhattan filed that information away. He'd observed the Tyranid hive fleets from orbit but hadn't yet encountered their infiltration organisms. The concept was horrifying from a human perspective, but elegant from a biological standpoint. Using a species' own reproduction against them was ruthlessly efficient. They reached a massive door marked with warnings in High Gothic and Low Gothic. Beyond this point, the hive's formal administration ended and gang law began. Saris produced a key that was half mechanical, half biological, inserting it into a lock that verified her identity through blood sample before opening. The underhive spread before them. It was darker here, illuminated only by bioluminescent fungi that grew in patches on the walls and ceilings. The architecture was ancient, not just old but ancient, dating back to the dark age of technology when humanity had possessed sciences that were now lost. Crumbling structures of unknown purpose served as homes, fortresses, and tombs for those who lived below. And the people. Manhattan perceived them immediately, humans who'd adapted to the underhive's toxic environment through mutation, augmentation, or sheer genetic luck. Many showed physical aberrations, extra limbs, glowing eyes, skin pigmentation altered by chemical exposure. By imperial standards, they should have been purged as mutants. But the underhive was too vast, too chaotic, too dangerous for systematic enforcement of purity laws. Welcome to the real Necromunda, Saris said. This is where the Imperium's grand ideals come to die. Down here, the God Emperor is just another distant authority who doesn't care if you live or starve. Down here, you survive by being stronger, smarter, or more ruthless than everyone else. Down here, humanity shows its true face, opportunistic, violent, and desperately clinging to existence despite everything the universe throws at it. Manhattan observed a group of children fighting over something in the shadows, not playing, but actually fighting with knives and improvised weapons. One child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, yet moved with the practiced efficiency of a trained killer. They're born into warfare, Saris explained, following his gaze. No childhood, no innocence. You learn to fight or you die. Most die. The ones who survive become the next generation of gangers, continuing the cycle. Why do you remain here? Manhattan asked. You have augmetics that suggest wealth. You could live in the mid-hive or possibly even the spires. Saris's laugh was bitter. You think it's about choice? I was born in the underhive. I clawed my way to matriarch through 30 years of gang warfare, political maneuvering, and more kills than I care to count. This place made me what I am. Leaving would mean abandoning the only identity I've ever known. Besides, she gestured at the darkness around them. Someone needs to maintain order down here. Not imperial law, but gang law. Rules that actually work in this environment. I'm harsh, but I'm fair. That's more than most can claim. Manhattan understood. This woman had carved purpose from chaos, created meaning in an environment that should have destroyed meaning entirely. She was, in her own way, as dedicated to humanity's survival as any custodian or space marine, just operating at a different scale with different methods. Show me more, Manhattan requested. Saris nodded and led him deeper. They passed through gang territories marked by crude sigils and more sophisticated hololithic projections. They observed a black market where illegal augmetics, forbidden weapons, and questionable substances changed hands for staggering prices. They witnessed a fight pit where desperate humans battled for entertainment and meager earnings. They encountered a shrine to the emperor that had been repurposed into a temple for something else, something the ecclesiarchy would definitely classify as heretical. And through it all, Manhattan observed humanity at its most desperate and most resilient. These people had every reason to give up, to surrender to chaos or simply cease existing, but they continued. They fought, loved, built communities, raised children, and maintained hope against all evidence that hope was justified. You're quiet, Saris observed after several hours. I expected more questions. I'm processing, Manhattan replied. This is different from what I expected. What did you expect? Despair, surrender, chaos, corruption overwhelming those who lacked faith's protection. Manhattan paused, examining his own assumptions. But I don't observe that. I observe adaptation. These humans have accepted their circumstances and found ways to survive within them. It's not idealistic or noble, but it's remarkably effective. That's humanity for you, Sarah said. We're cockroaches. You can stomp on us, poison us, burn our homes. We'll find a way to survive anyway. It's not pretty, but it works. A commotion interrupted their conversation. Screams echoed through the underhive, followed by sounds that Manhattan's enhanced perception identified as weapons fire and something else. Organic sounds, chittering and clicking that didn't match human vocal patterns. Genistealers, Saris hissed, immediately drawing weapons from hidden holsters. They're close. We need to... Manhattan was already moving, his consciousness extending outward to perceive the threat. 300 meters away, a nest of Genistealers had emerged from the hive's lower depths, attacking a civilian settlement. He perceived their biology instantly. Xenos organisms optimized for close combat, possessing 4 arms ending in molecular edge claws, accelerated movement speed, and rudimentary psychic connections to their brood. And they were slaughtering humans with terrifying efficiency. I'll handle it, Manhattan stated, already teleporting toward the attack. Manhattan materialized in the center of the Genistealer assault, his sudden appearance interrupting a creature mid-strike. The Genistealer's claws, each one a masterwork of evolutionary design, molecular edges sharp enough to slice through ceramite armor, passed through the space where Manhattan had been a microsecond earlier. He'd shifted his molecular structure to dispersed state, becoming effectively intangible. The settlement was a warren of interconnected hab units built from scavenged materials, home to perhaps 200 humans who'd carved existence from the Underhive's hostile environment. Now that existence was being systematically erased. Genostealers moved with horrifying coordination, their rudimentary hive mind allowing tactical precision beyond what individual predators should possess. They separated defenders from civilians, targeted adults before children to maximize terror, and moved with speeds that made them blurs to unaugmented human perception. Manhattan perceived 17 Genostealers, 43 dead humans, and 97 humans in various states of panic or resistance. The tactical situation was clear. Without intervention, the settlement would be completely destroyed within 6 minutes. He reconstituted his molecular structure and acted. The nearest Genostealer lunged at him, forearms extending in a killing pattern designed to provide no escape angles. Manhattan reached out and restructured the creature's cellular bonds. Not violently, he simply convinced the molecules comprising the Genostealer's exoskeleton that they no longer wanted to maintain their current configuration. The creature's carapace flowed like liquid, its limbs collapsing as structural integrity failed. It died without understanding what had killed it. Two more Genostealers detected the threat and redirected their attention toward Manhattan. They moved with that unnatural speed, crossing 20 meters in less than 2 seconds. Manhattan dispersed again, allowing them to pass through empty space, then reconstituted behind them and repeated the molecular restructuring. Both creatures collapsed, their biology failing at the fundamental level. The remaining Genostealers reassessed. Their hive mind processed Manhattan as a significant threat, priority target, eliminate before continuing civilian slaughter. All 14 remaining creatures turned toward him with perfect synchronization. Manhattan found their coordination fascinating. Each Genostealer was technically an individual organism, but they operated as extensions of a collective consciousness. It was similar to how he could divide his own attention across multiple tasks, except their coordination was instinctual rather than deliberate. The Genostealers attacked as a coordinated unit, approaching from multiple vectors simultaneously to prevent escape. But Manhattan didn't need to escape. He simply needed to exist in different locations. He teleported in rapid succession, appearing behind groups of Genostealers and restructuring their biology before they could adjust to his position. Each teleportation took microseconds. Each molecular restructuring took less time than that. Within 45 seconds, all 17 Genostealers were dead or dying. The settlement's survivors emerged from cover slowly, weapons still raised, unable to process what they just witnessed. Manhattan stood in the center of their community, surrounded by the corpses of Xenos predators that had been killing them moments earlier, and waited for their response. Matriarch Ceres arrived at a run, her augmented legs carrying her faster than unmodified humans could manage. She assessed the scene instantly: dead Genostealers, living civilians, Manhattan standing unmoved. "You killed an entire brood in under a minute," she stated, her voice carrying something between awe and calculation. "With no weapons, no visible effort, just thought?" "Molecular manipulation," Manhattan clarified. "I restructured their cellular bonds to induce cascade failure. It's more efficient than conventional violence when the target's biology is understood." One of the settlement survivors, an elderly man with augmetic eyes and a laser gun clutched in trembling hands, stepped forward. You saved us. The Emperor sent you. You're an angel of the Golden Throne, come to deliver his faithful from Xenos corruption?" "I'm not an angel," Manhattan interrupted gently. "I'm a transformed human. I intervened because the situation required intervention, not because of divine mandate." But the man was already dropping to his knees, and others followed. Within moments, half the settlement was prostrating themselves, offering prayers and thanks to the God Emperor for sending his divine agent to save them. Manhattan looked to Ceres for guidance. The matriarch's expression was complex, part amusement, part resignation. "Let them pray," she advised quietly. "Down here, people need to believe the Emperor cares about them. Whether you're actually his angel or not is less important than what your presence represents. Hope that someone powerful might actually intervene on their behalf for once." Manhattan observed the praying humans, their desperate gratitude, their tears of relief, their absolute conviction that divine providence had saved them. He could explain that his intervention had been pragmatic rather than theological. He could tell them he'd acted from curiosity and a preference for preserving complexity over entropy. But would that explanation provide comfort? Would it serve any purpose beyond satisfying his own need for accuracy? He remained silent and allowed them their interpretation. After the prayers concluded, the settlement's leaders approached, three scarred veterans who'd organized the defense before Manhattan's arrival. They introduced themselves as the Settlement Council and immediately began negotiating. "We owe you a life debt," the eldest counselor declared. "By Underhive law, that means we're bound to your service until the debt is repaid. Name your terms." Manhattan hadn't expected to acquire followers. "I don't require service. I intervened because I was present and capable. Consider the matter resolved." "Can't do that," the counselor replied firmly. "We have laws down here. Break them, and we're no different from the gangs who kill for sport. You saved 134 lives. That debt must be acknowledged." Sarah stepped in, her authority carrying weight even in this foreign settlement. "The blue skin is new to Underhive customs. Give him time to consider what payment would be appropriate. In the meantime, spread word that he's under my protection. Anyone who threatens him answers to me." The counselors accepted this compromise, and the settlement began the grim work of tending to their wounded and disposing of their dead. Manhattan helped where he could, using molecular manipulation to seal wounds that would otherwise prove fatal, restructuring damaged HAB units to restore structural integrity, even purifying water supplies contaminated by genestealer bodily fluids. Hours passed. The Underhive's perpetual twilight made time measurement difficult, but Manhattan's internal chronometer tracked each moment precisely. As he worked, humans approached him with questions, requests, and simple curiosity. Most had never seen anything like him. Some asked if he was a sanctioned psyker. Others wondered if he was a new type of space marine. A few correctly identified him as something genuinely unprecedented. He answered honestly when asked direct questions and remained silent when questions veered into theology or politics. The humans seemed to appreciate his straightforwardness, even when his answers contradicted their assumptions. A young woman approached him as he finished restructuring a collapsed wall. She couldn't have been more than 20, with augmetic hands that suggested she worked in one of the manufactorums. Her expression carried determination mixed with desperation. "You can manipulate matter," she stated. Could you fix my brother? He's sick. The hive's toxins are killing him, and we can't afford the medical treatments. If you could just restructure whatever's wrong." Manhattan examined the request. He could indeed restructure human biology to remove toxins, repair cellular damage, even reverse some forms of disease. But doing so would establish a precedent. People would expect him to solve their medical problems, and there were billions of sick humans in this hive alone. But this woman was standing before him, asking directly, and he just demonstrated his capabilities. Refusing would be logically consistent, but emotionally harsh. "Show me your brother," Manhattan decided. The woman led him to a small HAB unit, where a teenage boy lay on a pallet, his breathing shallow and labored. Manhattan perceived the damage immediately: toxic accumulation in the liver and kidneys, cellular degradation across multiple organ systems, beginning stages of cancer from prolonged chemical exposure. Without treatment, the boy had perhaps 3 weeks remaining. Manhattan placed his hand on the boy's chest and went to work. He restructured the accumulated toxins into harmless compounds that the body could process naturally. He repaired cellular damage at the molecular level, encouraging healthy tissue growth and eliminating cancerous cells. He optimized the boy's remaining organ function to compensate for permanent damage. The process took 15 minutes. When he finished, the boy's breathing had stabilized, his color had improved, and his vital signs registered as healthy rather than critical. The sister stared at her brother, then at Manhattan, tears streaming down her face. You just saved him. Just like that. No surgery, no drugs, just touching him. Molecular manipulation," Manhattan explained again. "His body was failing due to toxic accumulation and cellular damage. I restructured the problematic elements and optimized remaining function. He should recover fully." The woman dropped to her knees, reaching for Manhattan's hand to kiss it in gratitude. He gently withdrew, uncomfortable with the gesture, despite understanding its cultural significance. Your brother is healed. That's sufficient. But word spread rapidly. Within the hour, a line had formed outside the HAB unit. Desperate humans with sick children, dying parents, degenerative, augmetic failures, and countless other medical crises that the Underhive's non-existent healthcare system couldn't address. They begged Manhattan to help them, to touch their loved ones, to perform miracles. Saris found him surrounded by supplicants, his expression troubled in ways she hadn't seen before. "You look overwhelmed," she observed. "Not used to being worshipped?" "I'm not divine. I'm just capable. But they're treating capability as if it were divinity, and I don't know how to correct that misconception without causing harm." "Welcome to the Imperium," Saris replied. "Down here, anyone with power is either a threat or a savior. You demonstrated power by killing Genostealers and healing the sick. They've categorized you as savior. Fighting that categorization is futile. Better to accept it and set boundaries." Manhattan examined the crowd of desperate humans. He could help them all. He had the capability. But doing so would transform him from observer into active participant in ways that violated his intended purpose. He'd come to Necromunda to observe humanity, not to reshape it through miraculous intervention. Yet how could he observe suffering and refuse to act when action required minimal effort? The philosophical dilemma was genuinely challenging. Manhattan had thought himself beyond such questions. He'd believed his transformation had freed him from human moral considerations. But standing before desperate humans begging for help, he discovered that detachment had limits. "I'll help those in the settlement I just saved," Manhattan decided. "I intervened there, so I accept responsibility for following through. But I won't become a perpetual miracle worker for the entire Underhive. That's unsustainable and would fundamentally alter my relationship with this civilization." Saris nodded approval. "Reasonable boundary. I'll help enforce it. People will understand quid pro quo better than philosophical explanations about observation versus intervention." Manhattan spent the next several hours healing the settlement's sick and injured. He restructured disease, repaired trauma, even improved some augmetics that had been installed poorly by desperate back-alley surgeons. Each healing took minutes at most, but the cumulative effect was profound. He restored health to dozens of humans who would otherwise have died or suffered chronic disability. And with each healing, he felt the weight of their gratitude, their worship, their desperate need for someone powerful to care about their survival. It was exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with energy expenditure. When he finally finished, Manhattan retreated to a quiet corner of the settlement to process what he'd experienced. Saris joined him after ensuring the crowd had dispersed. "You did good work today," she said. "Saved lives, gave people hope. That matters down here." "I'm not certain I should have intervened so extensively," Manhattan admitted. "I came to observe, not to become a focal point for human desperation." "Too late for that. You saved a settlement from Genostealers and healed their sick. Stories are already spreading. The Blue Angel of the Underhive, the Emperor's quantum avatar, the savior from beyond the stars. By tomorrow, half the Underhive will know about you. By next week, the Spires will hear rumors. You've made yourself significant whether you intended to or not." Manhattan had feared this outcome. Significance meant attention, and attention meant disruption of his ability to observe authentically. He'd wanted to see how humans existed without his interference. Instead, he'd inserted himself into their struggles and fundamentally altered local conditions. "I should leave Necromunda," Manhattan decided. "My presence here has become disruptive." "Where will you go?" Manhattan considered his options. The Imperium was vast. 1,000,000 worlds, countless civilizations, infinite variations on human existence. He could observe forever and never exhaust the phenomena worth studying. "Everywhere," Manhattan replied. "I'll observe what I can, learn what I must, and try to minimize my impact on what I'm studying." Though today's events suggest that may be impossible. "Probably is," Saris agreed. "Power changes everything just by existing. You can't hide what you are, and what you are makes you important whether you like it or not. Welcome to the curse of capability. The more you can do, the more others expect you to do." Manhattan stood, preparing to teleport away from the Underhive. But before leaving, he turned to Saris one final time. Thank you for showing me the real Necromunda. It was illuminating. Saris smiled, an expression that softened the harsh lines of her scarred face. Come back sometime, Blue Angel. The Underhive could use more people who care about what happens down here, even if you care in your own weird, detached way. Manhattan teleported, leaving Necromunda behind. But the lessons remained. Dr. Manhattan drifted in the void between stars, allowing himself a moment of genuine stillness. Behind him, Necromunda continued its eternal cycle of violence and survival. Before him, the galaxy sprawled in all its brutal majesty. A million worlds burning with human determination, alien threat, and the constant pressure of chaos seeking to consume everything. He'd come to the 41st millennium seeking unpredictability, phenomena his original universe couldn't provide. He'd found that and more. The warp had shattered his perfect precognition, forcing him to experience genuine uncertainty for the first time since his transformation. The Emperor had shown him what happened when godlike power met impossible responsibility. The demons had taught him that even his quantum immunity had limits, not in corruption, but in the permanent mark they'd left on his consciousness. And Necromunda had demonstrated that humanity's true strength wasn't its technology or its faith, but its sheer stubborn refusal to surrender regardless of circumstances. Manhattan examined himself across multiple spectrums, perceiving the changes this universe had wrought. The warp mark glowed faintly in dimensions beyond normal space, Tzeentch's signature, ensuring the Chaos God could always find him. His molecular structure remained stable, but his consciousness had expanded in ways he couldn't have predicted. He thought differently now, processed reality with frameworks that incorporated both quantum mechanics and warp phenomena. He was neither fully the being who'd left his universe, nor fully adapted to this new one. He existed in between, transformed by observation as much as he transformed through observation. The Imperium would continue seeking his help. He'd closed the webway breach, proven his resistance to chaos, and demonstrated capabilities they desperately needed. They would ask him to solve other problems, repair the Golden Throne more permanently, fight demon incursions, perhaps even face threats like the Tyranid hive fleets or Necron dynasties. Each request would make sense individually. Each would serve humanity's survival. But Manhattan had learned something crucial on Necromunda. Power created obligation, whether he accepted it or not. The settlement's survivors hadn't asked his permission before worshiping him. The sick hadn't consulted his philosophical preferences before begging for healing. His mere presence had altered their reality. And pretending otherwise was self-deception. He could try to remain detached, maintain his role as observer rather than participant, but he'd already closed the webway breach. He'd already healed the Underhive's sick. He'd already become significant to beings who measured significance in terms of survival versus extinction. The question wasn't whether he'd continue intervening. The question was how deliberately he'd choose those interventions, and what principles would guide those choices. Manhattan perceived the Emperor's consciousness reaching across the void, a brief touch of acknowledgement. You have learned quickly. Power without purpose is merely capability. Purpose without wisdom is merely motion. You possess both now. Use them well. The galaxy burns, Dr. Manhattan, and you have chosen to stand near the fire. The Emperor's attention withdrew, returning to his endless vigil over humanity's scattered empire. Manhattan remained in the void, contemplating his next move. The galaxy offered infinite options. He could investigate the Eldar craft worlds and their mysterious psychic technology. He could observe the Tau Empire and their philosophy of the greater good. He could study the Necrons and their ancient war against reality itself. He could even venture to the edges of the Astronomican's light and observe humanity's frontier colonies struggling against isolation and xenospredation. Or he could return to Terra and accept a more formal role within the Imperium's hierarchy, becoming what they clearly wanted him to be: a weapon against chaos, a tool for solving impossible problems. Both paths had merit. Both would provide the unpredictability he sought. But perhaps there was a third option, one he glimpsed in the Underhive's desperate communities and the Emperor's decade-millennia burden. Perhaps observation and intervention weren't mutually exclusive. Perhaps he could study this universe while also participating in its survival, learning through action rather than detachment. It would mean abandoning the pure objectivity he'd maintained since his transformation. It would mean accepting that his presence changed what he observed. It would mean acknowledging emotional investment in outcomes rather than clinical analysis of probabilities. It would mean remaining human in ways he'd thought he'd transcended. Manhattan considered this possibility and found it acceptable, more than acceptable, interesting. If detachment had made him omnipotent but irrelevant in his original universe, perhaps engagement would make him meaningful here, despite his limitations. He teleported, choosing a destination at random from the Imperium's countless worlds. He would observe, he would learn, and when circumstances required, when his capability could prevent suffering without creating worse alternatives, he would act. Not as the Emperor's agent, not as the Imperium's weapon, not as the Blue Angel the Underhive had named him, but as Dr. Jonathan Osterman, transformed human, perpetual student of reality, walking the line between godhood and humanity in a universe that needed both. The Chaos Gods would continue tempting him. The Imperium would continue demanding his help. The galaxy would continue burning with endless war. And Manhattan would continue observing, learning, and occasionally intervening when quantum calculation and human intuition both suggested intervention, served purposes larger than his own curiosity. He had entered the 41st millennium seeking the unpredictable. He'd found a universe where even his powers had limits, where faith reshaped physics, where desperate humans carved meaning from impossibility. He'd found genuine uncertainty, genuine challenge, and genuine stakes. He'd found reasons to care, despite spending decades believing he'd transcended caring entirely. The mark of chaos glowed on his consciousness, permanent, indelible, a reminder that even immunity had costs. The Emperor's psychic presence touched the edges of his awareness, distant but constant, acknowledging his existence without demanding his allegiance. And somewhere in the underhive of Necromunda, humans told stories about the Blue God who'd saved them from Xenos monsters and healed their sick. Dr. Manhattan had become a myth in someone else's universe. Not the myth he'd been in his original reality, the detached godling who watched humanity from Mars, but something different, something engaged, something that might actually matter when the galaxy's countless crises came to their inevitable conclusions. He didn't know if that made him more human or less, but he knew it made him less alone. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where there was only war, even quantum gods needed reasons to hope. The future remained uncertain, scrambled by warp interference and the collective will of quadrillions. Manhattan couldn't predict what came next with the perfect clarity he'd once possessed, but for the first time since his transformation, uncertainty felt like possibility rather than limitation. He would continue observing, he would continue learning, and he would continue existing in this brutal, beautiful, impossible universe where humanity refused to surrender despite every reason to give up. Because if these desperate, flawed, magnificent humans could find meaning in the 41st millennium's darkness, perhaps a transformed physicist from another universe could find meaning there too.